Anime Autopsy here, and I need you to understand something about One Piece's world, because the community has fully lost the plot on what Oda is actually doing with geography and history. Every week I see someone post a panel of, say, Alabasta, with a caption that boils down to, "It's just a cool desert vibe, stop overthinking it." And listen to me, I need you to sit down, I need you to hydrate, because most of those takes are completely and utterly wrong. And I say this with love. I say this as someone who has watched fans argue in the comments for 3 days straight over whether Alabasta is generic Sandland, definitely Egypt, or Arabia, or something, I don't know, I failed social studies, while people throw around half-remembered SBS quotes and screenshots compressed worse than a 2006 AMV. One person circles the pyramids, another circles the outfits, a third just types crocodile equals Nile and disappears. The discourse is chaos. The analysis is shallow. Nobody is actually asking the basic storytelling question, what is the author pulling from and why? Because here's the thing, when it comes to One Piece's world building, we've fallen into this really unhelpful binary. Either Oda is a 4D chess god who mapped an entire alternate Earth on a corkboard in 1996, or he's just throwing darts at a globe and going, this arc is Spain now. One category worships every coincidence as intentional foreshadowing. The other treats the whole setting as random rule of cool nonsense. Both of those readings feel satisfying. Both are terrible at actually explaining what's on the page. The reality is way messier and way more interesting. East Blue quietly mirrors East Asia. Water 7 is not just Canal City. It is Venice with shipwright unions and Italian facades. Dressrosa isn't vaguely European. It is Spain with bullfighting flamenco silhouettes and a dictatorship history baked into the bricks. Wano is not just Samurai Island. It is isolationist Japan with Sengoku politics and closed borders as plot. None of this is random. None of this is subtle once you actually pay attention. And this is where I incriminate myself, because I have spent an embarrassing amount of my adult life zooming into background panels to identify specific architectural styles, pausing to Google regional dishes when Oda draws a throwaway plate of food, cross-referencing SBS interviews, data books, and real-world maps, basically turning into a pattern-seeking monkey who sees entire continents in toast. This is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal. Do not perceive me. But here's why we need to talk about this. If you handwave all of that as just fantasy, you miss what story is being told about empire, about who gets conquered, erased, or rewritten. If you only treat Skypiea as cool Cloudland and not a Mesoamerican coded civilization wiped off the map, you are literally missing half the narrative. The world government, Marie-Joie, the Void Century, these are not abstract world-building toys. They are pointed reflections of real power structures. And until we actually decode the history, mythology, and geography Oda is pulling from, we are reading One Piece with one eye closed. So here's where we need to be honest with each other. You saw the timestamp on this video, and your brain did the little 2.5 hours about pirates error message. This is normal. This is fine. But listen to me. We are not spending the next 2+ hours arguing about whether Water 7 is Italian coded in the vague vibe sense. What we're actually doing is pulling receipts. For the rest of this monster, I'm going to be cross-referencing panels, SBS answers, data books, author interviews, and real-world history to map One Piece's world onto ours in a way that is specific, sourced, and frankly a little disturbing once you see how intentional it is. Because here's the thing, my thesis is not, wow, Oda likes references. My thesis is that Oda built a parallel Earth. Geography, empires, racial politics, myth systems, all of it is a remix of real-world history. Alabasta isn't Desert Kingdom number 3. It's Egypt with a water crisis and a staged coup. Dressrosa isn't just Spanish flavor. It's Spain under dictatorship, bullfighting culture, and colonial guilt stuffed into one island. When you realize that, it changes how you read every arc going forward. To keep us from getting lost in the conspiracy board yarn, we're going to keep circling 3 big buckets. First, geography. Countries and islands, from East Blue's vaguely East Asian waters, to Wano as isolationist Japan, to Water 7 as a sinking Venice. Second, history and politics, the world government, celestial dragons, revolutionary army, and the void century as mirrors of real empires, slave economies, and world wars. Third, mythology, devil fruits, giants, lunarians, fishmen, minks, ancient ships and monsters, all stitched together out of global myth and religion. Method-wise, I need you to treat this as a guided world tour, not a random trivia dump. We'll go island by island and theme by theme. I'll show you the panels, name the real country's myths and events, and then actually argue why those connections are planned, not coincidence. Not pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast territory, but Oda literally said in SBS that Alabaster is based on Egypt territory. Pacing-wise, here's the roadmap so you don't feel trapped in a lore dungeon. We start broad, a global map pass matching each sea and major region to its real-world analogue, so you can see the skeleton of the parallel Earth. Then we zoom in, each Grand Line saga, each major power block, broken down into its historical and political inspirations. Finally, we zoom back out and ask the uncomfortable question, why these references? Why this empire structure, this genocide, this erased century, instead of the dozens of others the author could have used? If you stay to the end, you won't just be able to say, oh, Wano is Japan. You'll be able to say what period, what politics, what myths, and what that means for where the story is heading. And to get there, we need to start at the top, the map itself. So here's the thing. If you just stare at the One Piece map as a weird vertical noodle wrapped around a ball, you will never get it. You'll see fantasy world, author made it up, move on. This is the default take. This is normal. But if you actually treat it as a distorted globe, suddenly the nonsense starts behaving. I need you to picture a real Earth, then grab the continents and shuffle them in a drunken Jenga game. East Blue pulled from East Asia and generic maritime towns. Alabaster planted dead center as Egypt, down to the Desert River Kingdom and crocodile-themed colonial villain. Dressrosa screaming Spain with bullfights and flamenco flair. Wano obviously isolationist Japan. The land masses are scrambled, but the cultural DNA is still there, and that is our first coordinate system. So model number 1 in this atlas is the simple one. Direct country analogues. You look at the architecture, the clothing, the food, the language quirks, the music, and you say, okay, Oda, I see you. Water 7 is Venice plus broader Italian industrial imagery. It has canals, shipwright culture, and then suddenly we're in this heavy steel locomotive adjacent aesthetic that feels more Turin than tourist postcard. This is not a sin. This is how good commercial storytelling works. You mash recognizable visual shorthand into something fresh. But if you stop there, every island equals one country, stamped, done. You miss the deeper game. Which brings us to the second category, historical political echoes. The world government is not just generic evil empire. Mario Jouet borrows from Versailles and Vatican energy. A holy city on a red line, aristocrats in powdered aesthetics. A world summit that looks uncomfortably familiar if you've ever opened a history book. The Void Century and the Erased Ancient Kingdom read as a remix of real suppressed histories. Colonialism, great powers rewriting the record. Entire civilizations reduced to a footnote. Then there's the third layer, mythological and cultural stacking. This is where races, devil fruits, and religion come in. Giants pulling from Norse and broader European myth. Lunarians and sun god Nika imagery tying into global solar cults and slave rebellions. Fishmen and merfolk echoing everything from Greek sirens to Afro-Caribbean sea spirits. You get this vertical sandwich. Country analog on the bottom, political echo in the middle. mythic topping on the top. Now, listen to me, because this is where the community goes off the rails. Spotting this stuff is a skill, not a conspiracy board. We are not pattern-seeking monkeys seeing Jesus in toast every time Oda draws a church window. We're starting from what the author has actually said in SBS and interviews. Yes, this is based on Spain. Yes, this was inspired by Italy. And then carefully extending the pattern. So we need a standard. A real reference needs multiple coordinates lining up, visual motifs, naming conventions, explicit or near explicit author comments, and thematic parallels all pointing in the same direction. This vaguely reminds me of France, is nothing. This island has French architecture, French food, French coded names, and a revolution plot is a category. That difference is the whole method. Because once you accept that One Piece is a warped Earth map with rules, you can start doing something way more dangerous. You can use those rules to predict where the story is sailing next. And this is where I need you to slow down and not dismiss this as, oh, fun trivia. Because if we stop at, wow, Oda did a geography reference, we have completely missed what he's actually doing with power, with oppression, with freedom in this story. Here's the thing. When an author as intentional as Oda picks a culture or a historical wound to echo, he's not just decorating the set. He's picking a lens. He's deciding what kind of violence, what kind of resistance, what kind of trauma is going to be baked into that island's DNA before a single character opens their mouth. That's not a cute Easter egg category. That is theme selection. Take Fishman Island. On the surface, it's underwater fantasy racism. This is fine. This is normal. You can enjoy the arc at that level and still cry at Otohimi's death. But the second you clock that Fishman Island is basically a remix of racial segregation, slave plantations, and the civil rights movements, the entire thing snaps into focus. Jinbe isn't just a cool, honourable guy with a tragic past. He is a walking compromise. The dude trying to negotiate with a system built on his people's dehumanization. Fisher Tiger stops being badass rebel who freed slaves and turns into a composite of real-world revolutionaries who were brutalized by the very structures they fought, then punished for refusing to forgive their oppressors on demand. Otohime's pacifism stops reading as naive optimism and starts rhyming with every historical figure who tried to reform from within and got murdered for it. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. The celestial dragons aren't generically evil rich people anymore. They're a concentrated slurry of plantation aristocracy, colonial nobility, and divine right theology. The world government stops being cartoon fascists and becomes a stitched-together empire that's pulling from Rome, from European colonial projects, from Cold War realpolitik. Ignoring those inputs is how you end up with the shallow take. They're bad because they're bad. No, they're bad in very specific, historically documented ways. And Oda doesn't have to deliver a TED talk on any of this. That's the whole point. References are shorthand. You invoke Versailles and the Vatican in Marie-Geoise's architecture. You dress the celestial dragons as rotting Baroque popes in spacesuits. And your brain, even if you've never opened a history book, goes, oh, untouchable, God-coded aristocrats, old money, old blood. The emotional context is preloaded. The foreshadowing of what this institution is capable of is baked into the visual language. So when fans hand-wave this as a pattern-seeking monkeys seeing Jesus in toast, I get it. This is not a sin. This is how our community copes with over-analysis fatigue. But we need to admit the cost. If you strip out the historical and mythological scaffolding, One Piece flattens into adventure good, tyranny bad. And you miss how carefully Oda has planned which real scars he's reopening. By the end of this video, I want you to be dangerous with this. I want you to be able to meet a new island, clock the architecture, the food, the religion, the government structure, and go, okay, that's Spain with Franco-era repression, or that's isolationist Japan with American gunboats looming off screen. And then ask, why did he pick that one for this part of the story right now? Because once you start reading those choices as deliberate, the stakes of every reveal, every revolution, every buster call get a lot higher. And the next island we're sailing to? Yeah, that one's loaded too. So we need to get organized before we start screaming, "This is Spain," every time Oda draws a balcony and a ruffle. I need you to have a framework in your head, a little mental HUD, so you're not just trusting your inner pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast every time a character wears a poncho. Here's the thing. We're going to dissect this world through 3 lenses. Same story, same panels, 3 different angles. Geography and aesthetics, politics and history, myth and culture. You run every island through that checklist, and suddenly the references stop being trivia and start feeling intentional. Lens 1 is geography and aesthetics. This is the surface read, the travel brochure. Where are we on the map, and what does it look and feel like? I'm talking landscapes, coastlines, city layouts, climate, the way buildings stack or sprawl, what people are wearing, what they're eating, what the signage looks like. When you see Water 7's canals and shipyards, you're in Venice and general Italy. Alabaster's deserts, tombs, and river kingdom, that's Egypt. Dressrosa's sun-bleached stone, plazas and bullfighting arenas, that's Spain. None of that is an accident. It's the author drawing a very specific postcard. Lens 2 is politics and history. This is where it gets sharp. Who's ruling, how do they rule, and who's getting crushed underneath? Are we looking at a monarchy propped up by a colonial power, a fascist dictatorship, a failed state, a theocracy? What rebellions are brewing? What wars are echoing something we've actually done to each other on Earth? The world government is a stitched-together empire. Celestial dragons are aristocracy turned up to divine right insanity. The Revolutionary Army is every anti-imperial movement rolled into one. When Alabaster stages a civil war around drought and disinformation, that's not just drama, that's modern history with sand. Lens 3 is myth and culture. This is the deep code. What stories do these people tell about gods, races, curses, and miracles? Devil fruits pull from all over. Sun gods and tricksters, Norse storms, Japanese yokai, Afro-Caribbean spirit logic, giants, lunarians, fishmen, minks. Each race carries baggage from real-world legends and racial myths. Skypiea mashes Mesoamerican motifs with a vengeful god narrative. Wano is marinated in Japanese folklore and samurai cinema. When foreshadowing happens in this category, it's not just a power-up, it's a mythological payoff. Now watch how they overlap in one quick example, so this isn't just theory. Dressrosa, geography and aesthetics. Spanish architecture, flamenco vibes, bullfighting, toy soldier visuals, politics and history, a smiling televised dictatorship, disappeared people, a slave class literally turned into playthings. Myth and culture, tom-tatter fairies that echo European tiny folk, children's stories weaponized to hide real exploitation. Same arc, 3 categories, 3 data streams. Listen to me. I need you to start doing that on autopilot. This is not a sin. This is normal. As we sail from island to island, I want you mentally ticking those 3 boxes every time we dock. Where are we? Who's in charge and who's paying the price? What gods, monsters or myths are being smuggled in under the jokes? Because once that checklist is running in the background, the next arc we're about to hit stops being "oh cool new island" and starts being "okay, what real history is Oda about to quietly rewrite?" So let's zoom the camera out. We've been island hopping, but I need you to stop thinking in terms of next arc and start thinking in terms of entire planet, because Oda's map is not random. It's an aggressively cursed version of our own shipping lanes. Here's the thing. Structurally, the One Piece world is stupidly simple. 4 blues in the corners, a giant vertical continent, the red line slicing the globe in half, a horizontal nightmare ocean, the Grand Line, wrapping around the equator, flanking that the calm belts, those windless sea snake death zones. Then halfway through the Grand Line, it power levels into the New World. That's the whole board. But that board is just Earth's trade map run through a funhouse mirror. The Grand Line is not a crazy ocean where weather happens. It's a single, hyper-concentrated maritime artery. Think the Indian Ocean spice route, the old monsoon-driven Silk Road by sea, the Cape of Good Hope detour after Europeans got blocked from the land's Silk Road. All the money, all the rare resources, all the political secrets, they're flowing along one band of water. Of course, every pirate with ambition and every government with a navy dog piles onto that strip. That's not fantasy storytelling. That's the author just doing historical shipping lanes with extra lightning. Now, the calm belt and the red line are where Oda gets mean. The calm belt is a natural barrier. No wind, giant monsters, instant death for anyone without tech. That's your historical unchartable reefs, your doldrums, your Cape Horn storms that wrecked half the fleet. The red line is the political barrier, a literal wall continent that only has a few controlled crossings, functionally Suez Canal, plus Panama, plus Gibraltar, plus every colonial monopoly rolled into one. You don't pass unless the people on top say you pass. And this is where the world government's control stops being abstract. When they sit on the red line and ring the Grand Line with marine bases, that's the British Empire parking the Royal Navy on every choke point from Malacca to the Caribbean. It's the Dutch VOC gatekeeping Spice Islands. The map itself is foreshadowing. Power is wherever you can tax, blockade, or protect trade. Notice how the strongest pirates and marines are never just drifting in some random corner of the West Blue, having a vibes-based naval battle. They're clustered along the Grand Line, especially in the New World, the same way real piracy and naval arms races cluster around high-value routes. The Caribbean, the Strait of Malacca, the Barbary Coast. You don't get Yonko energy in the middle of the Pacific where there's nothing to steal. And once you accept that this whole planet is a warped shipping diagram, something else clicks. The East Blue stops being star to sea and becomes quiet periphery far from the main trade artery. Alabasta suddenly makes more sense on the map when you remember Egypt and the Suez. Dressrosa's position relative to marine strongholds starts looking intentional. We need to stop treating these placements as vibes and start treating them as coded geography. Because when we start pinning specific seas and arcs to real regions, the pattern goes from, oh, that's a cute reference, to wait, is Oda rewriting actual imperial history with clown pirates? And the next sea we're heading into is where that gets uncomfortably clear. And the uncomfortable part is, it doesn't start with Alabasta or Dressrosa. It starts in the place everyone writes off as baby mode, East Blue. Listen to me. East Blue is not a throwaway tutorial. It's a deliberately generic starter zone. It's Oda easing you into an alternate Earth by giving you a sea that feels familiar on purpose. Here's the thing. East Blue's job is to be home base, not for Luffy. For you. Before the author starts hitting you with, this is obviously Spain, or this is isolationist Edo Japan, he gives you towns that sit in this mushy, pan-European/rural Japan category. Coastal villages, windmills, docks, simple wooden houses. You've seen this place in 10 different JRPGs and 3 different Ghibli movies. This is not a sin. This is intentional onboarding. Fuchsia Village, Orange Town, Syrup Village. None of them scream a specific real-world country. They're more a vibe than a direct map. You get those low, white or wooden buildings, red roofs, a churchy spire here and there, some rice field adjacent hills in the background. It's a mashup of small European port towns and the kind of countryside Japanese kids see on school trips. The politics are equally low-res. A mayor, a sheriff, maybe one corrupt marine base. No parliaments, no coups, no revolutions. Just enough structure that your brain goes, yeah, that's a town. And because the setting is so soft focus, the conflicts stay small scale. Bandits in the mountains, petty pirates bullying villagers, a marine captain skimming off the top. That's feudal or early modern trouble, not world system trouble. We're not dealing with colonial extraction or global trade routes yet. We're dealing with the local warlord is a jerk energy. It keeps the storytelling personal and lets Oda establish character foreshadowing without you getting distracted by an entire fake nation-state's legal code. But even in this generic sea, you can see the real-world coding starting to sharpen at the edges. The Bharati is the clearest example. Floating restaurant, gaudy prow, big windows. That's already a European-style sea eatery. Then you add the tall hats, the French culinary flair, the emphasis on formal courses and presentation, and suddenly you're not in anywhere. You're in a stylized Atlantic Europe food culture. Sanji literally worships all blue, and his entire identity is tied to a restaurant that would not feel out of place off the coast of France or Italy. I need you to clock what's happening there. The community talks about Bharati as early One Piece being goofy, but it's also a test balloon. Oda is saying, what if I push one building, one crew, one menu a little further toward a real culture? This is normal. Authors do this when they're ramping up a planned motif. And once the crew hits Reverse Mountain and actually enters the Grand Line, that dial stops at a little further and snaps straight to aggressively specific. Alabasta is Egypt. Sky PA is Mesoamerica. Water 7 is Venice. Suddenly, every island is a new category of real-world reference. East Blue is the blurry tutorial map. The Grand Line is the HD remake. So we need to go sea by sea and watch that blur sharpen. Because the moment the merry crests that wave, the history cosplay starts getting dangerously explicit. But here's the thing. That blurry tutorial map East Blue, it's already running the political operating system the rest of the series will use. The textures are low res, sure. The code underneath is not. I need you to stop thinking of Arlong Park as a small self-contained tragedy and start reading it as the prototype build for Fishman Island, Mirajwa, and the entire race discourse of One Piece. Arlong's rule over Kokoyasi is not just bad guy taxes villagers, it's occupation. It's colonial administration wearing a Hawaiian shirt. He strolls in as a non-human conqueror, carves out territory, imposes tribute, and then delivers those speeches about fishmen being superior and humans being trash. That is racial supremacy rhetoric. It is the same category of speech you hear from the Celestial Dragons, just with more teeth and less bubble helmet. The author is already testing how far he can push oppression in a supposedly light pirate adventure. And the structure of it matters. Monthly payments, arbitrary executions, the psychological warfare of letting Nami buy the village while secretly colluding with the state to keep her poor forever. That's not random cruelty. That's economic exploitation as policy. It mirrors colonial systems where the occupied population pays tribute to an overlord race and is kept in permanent debt so they never ever get out. This is intentional world building. This is not a sin. This is how you foreshadow the later reveal that fishmen themselves were historically enslaved. Now, layer in Nezumi, the corrupt marine who shows up, pockets Arlong's bribes, and then raids Nami's house the second she gets close to freedom. He is not a cartoon one-off. He is a collaborationist bureaucrat. He's the Vichy mayor, the colonial governor's pet, the local authority who profits from occupation as long as he salutes the right flag. When you meet the world government proper and see how many kingdoms bend the knee for a heavenly tribute, you realize Nezumi was the baby version of a recurring pattern. The state doesn't have to be everywhere if it can outsource its cruelty. And notice the setting never screams, "This is X country." East Blue is still visually generic. But thematically, you already have discrimination, forced tribute, rigged markets, public executions. Roger's death in Loketown is framed exactly the way European port cities used to stage pirate hangings. Giant scaffold, cheering crowd, the state turning murder into theatre to sell its legitimacy. Fans will post that panel next to historical engravings and go, whoa, foreshadowing of the golden age of piracy. And listen to me, that instinct is correct, even if the vocabulary is off. It's not plot foreshadowing, it's reference foreshadowing. In other words, Oda is pre-writing the politics. He's locking in the themes before he slaps country skins on the islands. So when the series later says, this arc is Spain, or this arc is Egypt, that's escalation, not a pivot. East Blue is the tutorial not because it's empty, but because it's stripped of proper nouns. So you focus on systems. Who pays, who benefits, who gets hanged in the square. And we need to track how those systems get sharper as we head into the Grand Line. Because the next sea is where the cosplay stops being subtle and the history lessons get names and faces. So when the crew shoots up Reverse Mountain, that's not just, wow, fun water slide. That's Oda grabbing you by the collar and shoving your face into a world map. 4 oceans, 4 currents, all slamming into one impossible artery that spits you into the Grand Line. It's a cartoon, sure, but it's a cartoon of something very real. Global choke points where trade, risk, and profit all pile up in the same terrifying spot. Think about what Reverse Mountain actually is in story. Every major sea current is forced to climb the same peak, then drop into a single narrow entry lane. That's Cape Horn energy. That's the Cape of Good Hope on steroids. Historically, those capes were ship graveyards. Storms, rogue waves, bad charts, no backup. But if you wanted spices, gold, new markets, you went anyway. You rounded the Cape, or your economy stayed home. The danger wasn't a bug. It was the toll booth. And Oda just literalizes that toll. The first door to the Grand Line is a death ramp where one steering error means you're paced on the cliff. This is not subtle. This is the author taking real-world maritime history and turning it into a shonen quick-time event. You feel that same calculation every captain in the Age of Sail had to make. Is the payoff worth sailing into a blender? The answer, every time, is yes, because Empire runs on people saying yes to terrible odds. Now, here's the thing. Where you have deadly choke points, you also have infrastructure trying to tame them. Enter Crocus. Old guy, lighthouse, charts, local knowledge, medical expertise. He's an entire harbour authority crammed into one grandpa. Historically, you had lighthouses, harbour pilots who literally boarded your ship to steer you through reefs, signal systems, all of it built so trade could keep flowing through these lethal bottlenecks. Crocus is that entire category of people made diegetic. He's the human embodiment of, you will not survive this route without someone who's been here before. And parked under his cliff, Laboon. The giant whale is where this stops being just geography cosplay and starts being about roots and relationships. Laboon's whole tragedy only makes sense in a world of long-distance trade and migration paths. The Rumbar pirates don't just wander. They follow a repeatable line between West Blue and the Grand Line, carrying music, culture, and stories across oceans. They're merchant mariners with instruments instead of cargo, proof that these routes move more than goods. They move people, identities, entire communities. Listen to me. That promise between Laboon and the Rumbars is emotional foreshadowing for the entire series' global wiring. Ships leave, ships return, or they don't, but the route remembers. Crocus waiting, Laboon waiting, the ocean itself waiting. That's what a trade network is. A set of expectations that someone will come back through the same dangerous door. And if Reverse Mountain is the door, Twin Cape is the welcome desk. It's the last calm checkpoint before the Grand Line's real-world coding goes from vibe to, oh, that's just a country. Because once we slide into Whiskey Peak, into Baroque works, into a desert kingdom that is absolutely not Egypt, we need to talk about how Oda weaponizes geography and history by name. And that's where this stops being comfortable. So when we hit Whiskey Peak, this is where the vibe starts mutating into something sharper. It's not alabaster level explicit yet, but you can feel Oda twisting the dials. Sun-baked stone houses, stucco walls, narrow streets, that vaguely Mediterranean harbour town energy. And then in the middle of it, a colossal cactus mountain that looks more at home in a surreal western. This is not a clean country analogue. This is a hybrid. Here's the thing. Whiskey Peak isn't just a party town. It's a bounty hunter trap town. On a meta level, that's Oda doing a frontier outpost riff. Historically, you had settlements that existed to service travellers and then quietly exploit them. Toll stations, bandit run-ins, safe ports where you dock, and suddenly your crew is gone and your cargo is lighter. Whiskey Peak is that, turned into a Looney Tunes welcome festival. The Mediterranean colour palette makes you relax. The cactus silhouette and the Baroque works reveal tell you shouldn't have. Then Oda slams the gear shift into Little Garden. And I need you to notice how weird that jump actually is. We go from a quasi-European harbour trap to a straight-up prehistoric island, dinosaurs and primeval jungles everywhere, but the actual culture we focus on? Two giants who are basically Norse warriors on vacation. Dory and Brogy are wearing horned helmet-adjacent gear, fur, axes, the whole Viking-coded package. Their duel is framed around honour, oaths, and the we fight because we said we would ethic. That's not random. That's the author pulling from a Norse honour culture template and dropping it into a dinosaur terrarium. Is this meant to be, this is Scandinavia? No. It's a mashup. It sits in that uncomfortable middle category where the community keeps trying to pin a flag on it, but the geography and the myth don't line up cleanly on purpose. Pattern interrupt for your brain. If Oda wanted Little Garden to be dinosaur Scandinavia, he could have given us fjords, pine forests, long ships stranded in tar pits. Instead, we get tropical humidity, volcanoes, and two Vikings who got lost on a Monster Hunter map. This is not a sin. This is Oda testing how far he can stretch the mix and match before it breaks. Drum Island, Titans the Experiment, snowbound climate, steep cliffs, timber and stone houses with pitched roofs, castle spires poking through blizzards. Visually, that's European alpine architecture, some mix of Switzerland, Austria, maybe a hint of Eastern European monarchy in Wapol's cartoonish coat and crown. The politics reinforce it. A tiny hereditary kingdom, a self-indulgent royal family, and a medical crisis that literally shapes governance. Royal illness and medicine as political leverage is a very real historical pattern. You had courts where whoever controlled the doctor effectively controlled the king. Drum flips that. The king hoards doctors, exiles the good one, and the population freezes and dies. Chopper's origin is emotional, but structurally it's a case study in how fragile small monarchies are when healthcare is a monopoly. Listen to me. None of these islands are yet doing the "this is clearly Egypt" thing. They're prototypes. Whiskey Peak blends Mediterranean port with Western trap town. Little Garden fuses prehistoric fantasy with Norse giants. Drum Island welds alpine visuals to a micro-kingdom political drama. The writing here is Oda stress testing geography, politics and myth as separate sliders. And that foreshadowing isn't about plot, it's about method. He's rehearsing the technique he'll later use in Alabaster, Water 7, Dressrosa and beyond. Pick a region, pick a historical problem, pick a mythic lens, then lock them together. These early Grand Line arcs are the rough sketches before the full travelogue painting. Once we step into the desert next, you're going to see what happens when he finally stops hinting and just names the country with everything but the passport stamp. So when we hit Alabaster, that everything but the passport stamp line stops being a joke and turns into a design document. This is not Fantasy Desert Kingdom. This is Egypt with the serial numbers filed off so lightly they're still legible. You've got the full surface package, endless dunes, scorching sun, oases as literal plot points. The skyline is pyramids and tombs. We see ancient ruins half swallowed by sand, murals and inscriptions that read as hieroglyphic adjacent, and a royal line obsessed with preserving a history carved into stone. Even the name alabaster echoes alabaster, the white stone used in Egyptian art and sarcophagi. Oda has straight up confirmed in data books that alabaster's model is Egypt. He's not winking here, he's holding up a postcard. But here's the thing, the arc isn't just wearing Egypt cosplay for vibes. The entire dance powder plot is an essay on resource control. A manufactured drought, rain stolen from one region to feed another. A population that only knows scarcity, watching the capital stay suspiciously stable. You don't need to be a Middle East historian to see what's going on. This is water politics. This is irrigation as a weapon. This is the Nile, the Suez Canal, colonial powers drawing lines on maps and deciding who gets to drink. Historically, empires in North Africa and the broader MENA region have controlled not just land, but the flow of water and trade. British control over the Suez, French mandates, dam projects that decide which farmers live comfortably and which starve. In alabaster, dance powder is the cheat code for that kind of control. It's the foreshadowing-friendly, shonen-friendly version of whoever owns the infrastructure owns your throat. Enter Crocodile. On paper, he's a warlord. In practice, he's every external imperial actor who ever saw a resource choke point and thought, perfect coup weather. He doesn't invade with armies, he manufactures instability. He seeds Baroque works agents everywhere, stages false flag attacks, turns the drought into proof that the monarchy is corrupt, and then offers himself as the saviour. This is the coup playbook. This is the proxy conflict playbook. If you've ever read about foreign powers backing friendly generals in oil-rich states, you've already read the outline for Crocodile's plan. And while all that's happening in the present, Oda buries us in the past. The underground ruins, the poneglyph hidden in a lost chamber, a princess and a scholar literally descending into the tombs of their own civilization to read a forbidden script. That's not just ancient mystery flavour. That's Egyptology. That's Western obsession with digging up other people's graves, owning their artifacts, and deciding which histories are allowed to be public. The void century hangs over alabaster the way stolen mummies and missing sarcophagi hang over real-world museums. Listen to me. This is where Oda stops being coy about his project. We need to stop putting alabaster in the generic desert arc category. The author is doing intentional geopolitical storytelling. He's remixing Egypt, broader MENA resource conflicts, and imperial meddling into a single shonen thesis statement. Empires don't just conquer, they manipulate scarcity, rewrite history, and then sell you the rescue. And the scary part? Alabaster is early. This is him warming up. If this is the proof of concept for Empire in One Piece, then what he does with later nations and with the world government itself is the full dissertation you haven't read yet. I need you to hold that in your head, because the next stop on this travelogue makes the blueprint even harder to ignore. So we step off the grand geopolitical soapbox and suddenly we're in Nano Nane, getting sand in our shoes and taxed on the way in. And I need you to notice how fast Oda shifts from mythic desert kingdom to, oh, this is just a Mediterranean port the author has seen in a textbook. Nano Nohan is not some vague RPG town. It's a coastal trade hub bolted onto the edge of a desert empire. You've got the harbour, the customs choke points, the outer ring of cheap inns and warehouses, then the denser inner streets stuffed with markets and foreign merchants. That's Alexandria, that's Port Said. That's every city where empire says, we will concentrate the chaos of global trade out here, at the border, so the royal core never has to get its hands dirty. The foreign influences are literally quarantined at the edge of the kingdom, where the money comes in, but the people don't fully get in. Here's the thing. That layout is storytelling. It's foreshadowing in stone and sand. The further you go inland, the more the illusion of stability breaks down. Nano Nane is noisy, colourful, full of goods. By the time you hit the capital, the shelves are bare, and the posters are propaganda. Same country, different reality, and the road between them is the argument. Then Oda hits you with rain base, and this is where the pattern-seeking monkey brain in the community starts seeing Vegas in every panel. This is not a sin. This is normal. Rain base is a casino city in the middle of a dying desert, a gleaming tourist trap built on imported water and exported illusion. That's what certain regimes do. They carve out one hyper-controlled vice economy in a hostile environment to attract foreign capital and launder their image. You get the giant casino, the artificial rain, the promise that if you just step inside, scarcity doesn't exist. Except it does, because one sandstorm away, Yuba is choking to death. And Oda makes you walk there. Yuba is the dying oasis town, the community that bet everything on a promised infrastructure project and got hit with weaponized climate instead. The wind doesn't just happen to shift. Crocodile intentionally manipulates the natural system so the rain bypasses the rebels. That's not random weather. That's a policy decision with sand in its teeth. We need to sit with that for a second. In Alabasta, who lives and who withers is determined by who can redirect water, trade, and attention. Nananohan gets ships. Rainbase gets gamblers. Yuba gets abandonment and a dream in a hole. And the connective tissue between all three, camels and sandstorms. Travel in Alabasta is caravans, not trains. It's historical trade routes where your entire economy can be wiped out by a bad season or a single warlord putting a toll booth on the only viable path. Every sandstorm the crew fights isn't just a cool set piece, it's a reminder that desert commerce is permanently vulnerable to both nature and politics. So when fans say, oh, Alabasta is Egypt coded, listen to me. That's the shallow read. The deeper, more uncomfortable read is that the geography is a functional allegory for how power and resources flow in real desert nations right now. Ports at the edge, showcases in the middle, sacrifice towns in between. And if Oda can do all of that with one kingdom this early, what happens when we zoom back out to the entire world map he's been quietly sketching in the background? So if Alabasta is Oda doing a political cartoon of a modern desert kingdom, Jaya and Skypiea are him taking a sledgehammer to an entire erased continent. I need you to actually picture Shandora for a second. The stepped pyramids, the broad stone terraces, the glyph-covered blocks half swallowed by jungle. That's not vague fantasy ruins. That is Mesoamerica with the serial numbers filed off. You've got facades stacked in receding tiers, just off from real Maya temples, staircases running dead center, and facades plastered in spiral suns and Jaguesque faces. The stonework is tight, geometric, obsessively patterned. Then Oda buries it in vegetation, trees punching through roofs, roots cracking the masonry. Here's the thing, that exact visual of a sacred city eaten by the forest is burned into our brains from photos of Tikal, Palenque, Chichen Itza. He's not improvising, he's quoting. And the people attached to those ruins, the Shandians are an indigenous coded community down to the bone. They're brown-skinned, tattooed, wearing feathered headdresses and beadwork. Their entire identity is tied to a land that was literally ripped out from under them and sent into the sky. That's not just cool world building. It's a planned echo of indigenous nations shoved off ancestral ground by colonizers chasing resources. The upper yard was their soil, their graves, their history. Now it's a commodity. Enter Enel, self-proclaimed god with his priests and his divine law. This is where the metaphor stops being subtle and starts waving at you with a neon sign. His rule over the Sky Islands is religiously justified conquest. He occupies a sacred site, strips it for gold, and weaponizes theology to call that plunder destiny. We're in the same category as colonial missions built on top of temples, crosses hammered into pyramids while priests catalogue which idols to melt down, And then Oda twists the knife with the City of Gold legend. To the Skypians and Shandians, Shandora is holy ground and a graveyard. To pirates and the outside world, it's El Dorado, a rumour of infinite wealth in the sky. Bellamy literally mocks dreams, then gets folded when that myth turns out to be real. That's a perfect little foreshadowing joke about how European powers treated the Americas, not as living cultures, but as treasure chests and data mines. Buried at the heart of that treasure, a poneglyph, an indestructible stone record, hiding in a Mesoamerican ruin, holding a fragment of a history the global superpower has tried to erase. This is not a sin, this is not subtle, this is Oda rubbing damnatio memoriae in your face. The world government punishes anyone who can read it, burns scholars, bans the language. Real empires did this. Aztec codices torched, Maya books reduced to ash, oral histories overwritten by official chronicles. And Skypiea itself is forgotten. Nobody on the blue seas believes in it. Its war, its god, its sacrifices never enter the official timeline. We need to sit with that. Because when a sky island can be deleted from history, a whole century going missing suddenly feels very plausible, doesn't it? And if a jungle temple can hide a truth the world government fears, what happens when we start comparing those poneglyphs to another forbidden monument sitting in plain sight on the seafloor? And if a jungle temple can do that, I need you to zoom out and ask a worse question. What happens when the forbidden monument isn't a stone slab, but an entire planet? Enter Enel, Fairy Verth, and the most on-the-nose colonial fever dream Oda has ever drawn. Enel's whole deal is the moon is my promised land. A pure, untouched world. Infinite soil. No noisy natives. It's not random. That's just manifest destiny with extra voltage. This is the same fantasy that sold the New World to Europeans, then got recycled into space colonization rhetoric. Empty frontiers, virgin lands, nobody important there until we show up and plant a flag. The problem is, historically, those lands were never empty. They were only empty on the maps of the people doing the conquering. Here's the thing. Skypiea bakes that lie directly into its religion. The Sky Islanders are taught to fear the upper yard, to treat the very ground as taboo. Enel hijacks that system, slaps I am God on his forehead, and suddenly you have a textbook case of religion weaponized for conquest. Forced labor building his ark. Cultural suppression of the Shandians. Public executions framed as divine punishment. If you've read anything about the Americas under the cross and the sword, this is not subtle. And Oda is intentional about who gets called heretics. The people clinging to Shandora's history, the ones protecting the poneglyph, they're the problem. The world government brands that stone as dangerous. The same way real empires treated indigenous codices, oral histories and monuments as demonic, backward, or just inconvenient. Burn them, ban them, bury them under a bell. This is fine. This is normal if your goal is to win the history writing game. Pattern interrupt. Enel actually gets to the moon. And it's not empty. It's a graveyard of an even older civilization, with Lunarian-looking motifs and those little space automata. Suddenly Fairy Verth isn't a blank canvas. It's a palimpsest. That's where Oda starts poking at another category of real-world nonsense. Fringe archaeology. The idea that some lost master race, some ancient hyper-advanced culture is responsible for all impressive ruins and conveniently maps on to whatever nationalist or supremacist narrative a group wants to push. In other words, even outer space in One Piece has already been colonized, misremembered, and mythologized. Fans treat those cover stories as fun extras, but the author is quietly showing you how discovery is always discovery for someone and erasure for someone else. Listen to me. Skypiea is not a random sky detour. It's Oda running a full colonialism arc in disguise, dressed up in clouds and dials, so 12-year-old me doesn't notice I'm reading a Mesoamerican tragedy. The Shandian city is Maya/Aztec coded. The golden bell is your contact relic. The God King is a lightning-powered conquistador. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you accept that the series did a whole colonial critique in the clouds, the next question is obvious. If the sky and the moon are rehearsals, what does that say about the age of exploration happening on the sea right now? And if the Sky Island was Oda doing a colonial critique in cosplay, Water 7 is him going, okay, no more warm-up. Let's talk about capitalism and courts. I need you to see this arc not as the Cool Train 1, but as Oda quietly dropping you into Italy and asking, so how do you feel about the machinery of justice? Water 7 is Venice with the saturation slider broken. Canal-based city, tiered islands, waterways instead of streets. Gondola-like Yagara balls doing Uber Eats for ship parts. The architecture is straight up Venetian and broader Italian coastal. Domes, bridges, stacked stone facades. But here's the thing. He doesn't stop at tourist postcard Venice. He bolts on Italian industrial imagery, cranes and dry docks and massive warehouses. So the city becomes this hybrid of romantic canal town and brutal shipbuilding plant. That's not random. Historically, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, these maritime republics ran on shipwright culture. Their entire economy was, we build ships, we control trade, we project power. Galley La is that history turned into a shonen workplace comedy. You get the celebrity foreman, the unions, the pride in craft. The author is pulling from a very specific category of city-state, where labour on the docks literally built empires. When Iceberg talks about funding the sea train to save Water 7's future, that's an industrialisation problem. Adapt or drown. And then Oda asks, what happens when the trains and courts belong to someone else? Enter Eni's lobby. This place is absurd on purpose. A massive courthouse that never acquits, a bridge that goes nowhere, an endless waterfall into the abyss. It's Versailles meets fascist ministry building, scaled up until the architecture itself is yelling at you. The whole island is one big piece of visual foreshadowing. Justice here is not about verdicts, it's about spectacle and inevitability. European judicial complexes have always been built to project state power. Huge staircases, columns, statues of blindfolded ladies holding swords. Eni's lobby just removes the pretense. The gates, the drawbridges, the literal gates of justice are machinery. Once you're on the track, you are processed. This is not a sin. This is normal for authoritarian systems. The performance of law matters more than the content of law. CP9 slots right into that. Secret agents embedded as workers, smiling with you in the shipyard by day, handing you to the noose at night. Listen to me. That is textbook secret police. You can map them onto fascist Italy's Ovra, onto various European intelligence services that justified disappearances as protecting order. The Buster Call is the military version of that logic. Push a button, erase an island, file it under justice. It is industrialized violence, the same way the sea train is industrialized movement. And we need to underline this. The Italian aesthetic is not a random skin. It matters that this story about labor, surveillance, and weaponized law happens in a space coded as Europe. Fans often meme Water City go bruh. But the writing is doing something more intentional. It's saying the modern world of courts, trains, and corporations did not appear out of nowhere. It was built on purpose by hands. Which raises the next question. If this is how one city and one courthouse work, what does that imply about the capital of the entire world? Which is exactly where Water 7 walks in, dripping, coughing, and pretending everything is fine. Because listen to me, this goofy shipwright city with cow trains is one of the most grounded climate allegories in the story. Water 7 is literally sinking, not metaphorically. Every year, Aqua Laguna hits harder, whole districts get swallowed, and the solution is to just move uphill and pretend the lower rings never existed. That's not fantasy. That's Venice building raised walkways. That's Jakarta subsiding so fast they're planning a new capital. That's New Orleans after Katrina, where certain neighborhoods never really came back. The author is not being subtle. This is a planned, intentional echo of coastal cities staring down rising seas and land that is physically giving way. And here's the thing. Oda doesn't just stop at, oh no, water bad. He asks, what does a city do when its geography becomes a problem for capital? Iceberg's answer is the sea train, a massive infrastructure bet, a mega project, a literal iron line that ties Water 7 into Eni's lobby and Pucci-sounding hubs, and suddenly reorients trade. This is where we need to talk about who wins when you build something that big. Because in our world, canals and rails and highways always have winners and losers. Suez and Panama rewired global shipping. High-speed rail in Japan or China privileges some corridors while rural areas get stranded. That's not a bug. That's the category of project we're dealing with. In Water 7, you see the same pattern. The shiny station, the economic core, the shipyards that get to plug into government contracts. They're protected, elevated. Meanwhile, the old lower districts quietly become sacrifice zones, written off. If your home is in the part of town that floods every aqua laguna, the unspoken policy is you move or you drown. This is not a sin unique to fantasy governments. This is exactly how modern cities treat flood-prone neighborhoods, industrial belts, and favelas. It's zoning as triage. It's saying, out loud in policy if not in words, we will not save everything. I need you to notice what the sea train actually connects. It is not a random commuter line. It links a judicial island, a shipbuilding hub, and the world government's front-facing institutions. That's textbook statecraft. In history, rail networks in Europe and the US were deliberately planned to tie peripheries to capitals, to move troops and goods, to make rebellion logistically harder. You run tracks through where you want power to flow. You skip where you're comfortable letting decay set in. Water 7's tracks are doing that same storytelling work. So when fans treat the sea train as, wow, cool transportation upgrade, this is normal, but it misses the intentional writing. Even the vehicles in One Piece are political references. They foreshadow who gets folded into the world government's future and who gets left to sink. And if this is the logic for one train line, what does that say about the entire global map of routes, currents and gates we've been shown so far? So if even a train schedule is secretly geopolitical foreshadowing, I need you to ask what happens when Oda stops drawing cute Venice and starts drawing Europe's nightmares. Enter Thriller Bark, the part of the map where the story sails straight into a Universal Studios backlot and somehow still stays on theme. Visually, this arc is a European Gothic greatest hits album. You've got the oversized Transylvanian castle, the fog-choked graveyards, the crooked iron fences, the full moon permanently stuck on Halloween special. It's Bela Lugosi Dracula smashed into a Hammer Horror marathon. Then you layer in Hogback's lab and the operating tables and the stitched up corpses, and suddenly you're in Frankenstein country, that 19th century fear of mad science tearing the soul out of the human body, just with more chibi ghosts and a reindeer doctor in a hat. Here's the thing. Moria's whole gimmick is corpse stealing and a zombie army. That's not just ha-ha spooky. That's the author reaching straight into 18th, 19th century Europe, where body snatching was an actual industry. Medical schools needed cadavers. The law didn't supply enough. And so you got grave robbers digging up fresh burials for cash. Hogback is basically the nightmare version of an unethical surgeon stitching together soldiers from stolen bodies, while Moria treats human remains as inventory. This is the exact anxiety those old horror novels were chewing on. What happens when science and power decide your body is a resource, not a person? And then Perona walks in and reminds you Oda is not just copying the West, he's remixing it. Her whole gothic Lolita aesthetic is a Japanese subculture that already cannibalizes Victorian and Rococo fashion. Frills, parasols, doll silhouettes, and turns them into something cute, morbid, and performative. Oda stacks that on top of a European horror setting. So you're watching a Japanese reinterpretation of European aristocratic style. This is not a sin. This is not random. This is Oda doing cultural sampling with the same intentionality he uses for Alabaster's Egypt or Dressrosa's Spain. Functionally, Thriller Bark feels like a tonal breather after Eni's Lobby. The community treats it as the Halloween filler party before we get serious again. This is fine. This is normal. But under the Scooby-Doo jokes, the arc keeps drilling the same thesis. In this world, death, bodies and souls are manipulable commodities. Shadows can be stolen, corpses repurposed, personalities reassigned. That's not just horror flavor. That's early groundwork for how the story later talks about lineage factors, bloodlines and inherited wills being copied, engineered, or erased. Listen to me. When an arc that goofy is still echoing real European fears about desecration and medical abuse, that's not coincidence. That's planned storytelling. Even when Oda is just doing genre parody, he's choosing a very specific historical anxiety to parody. Thriller Bark is teaching you to accept that identity can be cut up and redistributed. So when we hit the truly monstrous experiments of the New World, you don't flinch. You recognize the category. And if this is what he does with One Haunted Island, what do you think he's hiding in the bright heroic myths of gods, giants, and ancient weapons? Which drops us straight onto the mangrove roots of Sabaody, where the horror stops being a rumor and starts being architecture. I need you to hold that in your head. This is the first time One Piece stages the Atlantic world, not as subtext, but as a theme park you can walk through. On the surface, Sabaody is gorgeous. Sun-drenched, carnival music, cotton candy bubbles floating past your face. It's a resort built on the roots of the Yarukiman mangrove, the ground itself literally hollow and spongy, so you're already walking on something that doesn't feel stable. That's not an accident. The whole place is designed with amusement park aesthetics, Ferris wheel silhouettes, souvenir stalls, camera-happy tourists, while underneath, in the numbered groves, there's a slave market running on schedule. The visual joke is that you can buy balloons and human beings in the same afternoon. Here's the thing. That's not a fantasy. That's Charleston, that's Havana, that's Rio. Historical port cities where ships docked, rum and sugar changed hands, and human beings were auctioned in central squares as if they were another category of cargo. Oda stages the auction house on Sabaody with the same cold bureaucracy. Numbered slaves, displayed for inspection, bid paddles. A smug auctioneer. The Straw Hats don't stumble into a vague bad place. They walk into a very specific transatlantic memory, stripped of dates but not of procedure. And presiding over it all are the celestial dragons waddling Versailles in fish bowls. These people are not just random cartoon tyrants. They're concentrated references to European aristocracies and plantation elites who treated entire populations as property secured by divine right. The way the crowd drops to the ground when a dragon passes, the way marines snap to attention, the way a noble can point at Cammy and convert her into an object with a sentence. That's the social physics of slave societies. It's feudalism welded to the Atlantic slave system and then inflated until it squeaks. Now, zoom out to the bubbles. Those playful soap spheres are Sabaody's brand. Tourism, entertainment, and the coating industry that lets ships sink safely to Fishman Island. But the whole bubble economy is built on a site of active trafficking. That's the metaphor. Modern port cities that run cruises over water where slave ships once sailed. Plantation houses turned into wedding venues. Former auction blocks reduced to plaques you walk past on your way to buy gelato. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is how capitalism metabolizes atrocity. Polish the surface, sell the tour, keep the foundation. Pattern interrupt. Remember when you first watched Sabaody and thought, whoa, this arc got dark fast? It didn't. The darkness was always there. The camera just tilted down. So when fans say Oda hinted at slavery, I'm going to be a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast and tell you, no, here he's screaming. The chains on Hachi, the brand on the slave's back, the fishman's history of being hunted, Sabaudi stacks every Atlantic echo it can in one place. We need to stop treating this as background flavour and start reading it as the author drawing a line directly from the world government's birth to our own. And once you see that line, the next step is obvious. You go ask what happens to the people who live under that system when they finally get a flag and a ship of their own. You go ask what happens to the people who live under that system when they finally get a flag and a ship of their own. And that's your bridge straight down to Fishman Island. Listen to me. This isn't just underwater arc with candy and mermaids. This is Oda taking the entire Atlantic slave trade, Jim Crow and apartheid, shoving it 10,000 meters under the sea and saying, here, look at it. You don't get to pretend you didn't know. The physical separation is the point. Out of sight, out of mind, out of the sun. Fishman Island is a ghetto with better lighting. It's a reservation, a township, a place literally crushed between the world above and the dark below, where the only way to breathe is under someone else's ceiling. That bubble is not just cool world building. It's a controlled environment. The world government gets to say, see, they're safe down there, while keeping them conveniently distant from human eyes. That is planned segregation turned into geography. Here's the thing. Once you read it that way, Fisher Tiger stops being just a badass with a tragic backstory and turns into a composite of every slave rebellion you were half asleep for in history class. He scales the red line, frees slaves from Mary Joycey, and then brands them with the sun. That's not random pirate aesthetic. That's maroon communities. That's Haitian revolution energy. That's taking the burned-in mark of ownership and overwriting it with a symbol of resistance. The Sun Pirate's tattoo is foreshadowing and commentary at the same time. It hides the hoof of the celestial dragon, yes, but it also says, your attempt to mark us forever. We will incorporate it, distort it, and make it ours. It's the same move as marginalized communities, reclaiming slurs, reclaiming hairstyles, reclaiming music genres they were mocked for. This is not a sin. This is normal counter-violence in symbolic form. Then Oda swings the pendulum. Queen Otohome is the other strategy. Non-violent activism, petitions, speeches about coexistence with humans. I need you to clock how on the nose this is. She's soft-spoken, religiously committed to peace, begging her own people not to let justified rage calcify into permanent separation. And what happens? She's assassinated, her message is smeared, and the community fractures around her memory. That is Martin Luther King Jr. energy. That is every civil rights leader murdered for daring to argue that integration is worth the risk. Jinbe sits right in the middle of that argument. Former Sun Pirate, then Shichibukai, then Straw Hat ally. He's the internal debate of a colonized community turned into a guy who punches sea monsters. Do you work within the system and compromise or reject it entirely? Do you choose Arlong's revenge or Otohime's reconciliation? Jinbei's whole political evolution is Oda writing the messy, non-aesthetic parts of liberation movements the fandom usually skips. And when Luffy stands there taking blows for the island, those speeches hit harder once you map them onto Atlantic slavery and civil rights. You're not just watching a cool shonen climax. You're watching a story about whether a people buried by history ever get to breathe real air. Which, unfortunately for your tear ducts, is not the only time Oda does this. And if Fishman Island is Oda doing Atlantic slavery through a candy-coloured filter, Punk Hazard is him going, cool, what if we just adapted the Cold War straight into shonen? I need you to sit with that for a second, because this frozen and boiling hellscape is not random. It's a test site. Punk Hazard is basically a mashup of nuclear proving ground, chemical weapons lab, and Black Ops research base. You've got a dead island, permanently scarred by a gas weapon that turned every living thing into statues. You've got kids abducted and experimented on, their bodies stretched and broken in the name of science. That's not subtle. That's Unit 731 in World War II. That's MK Ultra in the US. That's every declassified document where a government quietly admits, yeah, we dosed our own people to see what would happen. The imagery is nuclear wasteland on one side, toxic disaster on the other, with a cartoon smile painted over it. And at the center of it, you get Caesar Clown, who is Oda's most on-the-nose caricature of the amoral scientist. He's not a tragic genius. He's not conflicted. He is the guy who will manufacture weapons for anyone with a checkbook and then blame the victims for not being strong enough to survive his gas. That's your stand-in for chemical weapons programs, for industrial catastrophes where corporations cut corners and entire towns choke for decades. Caesar is the author taking all those real headlines, compressing them into one cackling clown and asking you, do you still think this is just zany mad science? Here's the thing. Punk hazard doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a pipeline. Weapons and drugged up kids go out. Money and political power come in. And when you follow that pipeline, it drops you straight into Dressrosa. Dressrosa is Oda putting a giant Spain label on an island and daring the community to miss it. You've got the bullfighting coliseum, flamenco-inspired outfits, Spanish names all over the cast, sun-drenched plazas and Mediterranean arches. This is not a sin. This is not subtle. This is an author telling you exactly which historical drawer to open before you start analysing Doflamingo. Because Doflamingo is not just Evil King number 17. He's a composite dictator. You can see Francoist Spain in the smiling tourist facade and the brutally repressed interior. You can see Latin American juntas in the disappeared citizens, in the way people just vanish from the record. Except here, they don't vanish. They're turned into toys. They keep working, keep serving, while everyone forgets their names. That's forced disappearance plus propaganda machine, run through a toy box filter to make it just barely digestible for Jump. And the toy slave system is not just a clever twist. It's colonial labour. It's modern human trafficking. It's unpaid, unacknowledged bodies powering an economy that pretends to be free. The underground trade in smiles and weapons. The kids from Punk Hazard. The slaves in Dressrosa's factories. They're all one supply chain. Oda is foreshadowing the idea that in this world, the smiling theme park countries and the horror labs are not opposites. They are business partners, which unfortunately means when we zoom out to the people buying all of this from the shadows, the real world parallels get even uglier, which is where Dressrosa stops being Spain but make it flamenco and turns into something a lot colder, a case study in how empires edit reality. And Oda doesn't start with kings or admirals. He starts with the tiniest people in the country. The Tontata are straight out of European fairy folklore. They're the little people from forest stories. Tiny, earnest, living under trees and floorboards, convinced that humans are these grand, half-mythical beings. They do the chores, they fix the tools, they farm the food. In old tales, they're gullible but kind. In Dressrosa, that gullibility is weaponized. The humans literally run a plantation on their backs, pay them in lies, and call it coexistence. That's not an accident. That's an author taking a cute fairy trope and asking, okay, what happens when the Empire discovers you're real? Here's the thing. The toys are the same argument, just escalated. The toy curse is a metaphor for disappeared people under authoritarian regimes. When someone turns into a toy, they're not just physically transformed. They're erased from documents, from photographs, from memory. Their own families walk past them in the street. That is exactly how forced disappearances work in real history. The body vanishes, the file vanishes, and over time the person only exists as a rumour you're not supposed to repeat. And Oda doesn't hide this under subtext. He makes it domestic. He makes it about kids. Dressrosa's children grow up in a country where the king was always Doflamingo, where Riku was always a demon, where the factories were always for toys and smiles. Textbooks, public statues, parades, news broadcasts, every tool is pointed at one goal: make the lie feel older than you are. If you've ever read about school curricula under Franco, or Pinochet, or modern textbook fights over war crimes, you know this is not a fantasy problem. This is standard operating procedure. Pattern interrupt for your brain here. The most horrifying part of Dressrosa isn't the birdcage, it's the dinner table. It's the mother who no longer remembers she had a son, the fiancé who walks past her partner in the street, the child who only knows their missing parent as, oh, they must have left. I need you to sit with that for a second, because in our world, there are entire generations who grew up never seeing the names of political prisoners, never hearing about massacres, because those names never made it into the official story. So when you see a tontata cheerfully hauling cargo for a factory they think is making toys, or a toy soldier saluting a king his daughter can't remember, that's Oda doing very intentional political storytelling. He's foreshadowing the bigger One Piece question: who gets to decide what a normal history looks like? The point of Dressrosa isn't Spain aesthetic plus corrida. The point is to walk you through the mechanics of memory control in a bright, noisy sandbox so that when we hit the void century, you already understand how easy it is to delete a whole people and then sell that deletion to their children as patriotism. And if an island this cartoonish can run that experiment, what do you think the world capital is doing on a global scale? And if an island this cartoonish can run that experiment, what do you think the world capital is doing on a global scale? Now listen to me, because before we get to the literal world capital, Oda drags us somewhere way more personal. He takes us home. Zu and Wano are the point where the alternative Earth stops being a travelogue and starts being a mirror held up to Japan. And you can feel the author getting uncomfortably honest with his own country's myths. Zu is the soft opening, an enormous elephant walking the seas for 1,000 years, carrying a closed tradition-bound society on its back. That is, isolation as geography. The minks live in treehouse villages, wear old-school armor, follow inherited laws, and until the Straw Hats show up, the outside world is a rumor. You've got hints of indigenous coding in there too. Furred, animal-linked people whose land is literally a living being, whose culture is older than the world government, who get genocidal attention the second they're politically useful. If your pattern-seeking monkey brain is pinging Ainu and other indigenous groups Japan stepped on and then memory hold, this is not a sin. This is normal. Then Wano walks in and rips the subtlety out by the roots. Sengoku isn't a metaphor anymore. It's the text. Orders closed, ships destroyed, news censored. Execution on site for outsiders. The architecture is straight Edo period. Tiered castles on hills, paper doors, town streets lined with wooden shops and lanterns. The entire social structure is samurai and peasants under a shogunate, with a nominal shogun ruling in the name of a distant, unseen sovereign. You're not guessing the reference, you're being hit over the head with it. Here's the thing. Oda doesn't just cosplay Edo Japan and call it a day. Orochi and Kaido's regime is a mashup. Orochi is the corrupt feudal elite, a petty, paranoid strongman wrapped in the aesthetics of authority. Kaido is the foreign-backed war machine, dropping factories, weapons research, and military alliances on top of that feudal rot. That fusion feels intentional. Pre-Meiji power struggles colliding with the later militarist state, where traditional hierarchies got hijacked and supercharged by industrial arms building and outside tech. And Wano pays for it in smoke, poisoned rivers, weapon plants, child labour, entire regions turned into industrial dead zones so the capital can party under artificial cherry blossoms. That's not just evil villain base decor. That's Minamata disease, post-war factory pollution, and the human cost of Japan's sprint into modernity compressed into one storyboard. The storytelling is doing historical revisionism in reverse. Instead of sanding off the edges, it sharpens them. I need you to see how aggressive that is coming from a Japanese author writing for a Japanese audience. The samurai in Wano are not a monolith of noble honor. They're fractured, complicit, sometimes cowardly, sometimes heroic. Isolation isn't portrayed as pure victimhood. It's a policy that made the country easier to capture from the inside. Even the suffering under Kaido and Orochi doesn't erase Wano's own agency in building the conditions for its fall. So when fans talk about Wano as samurai hype country, we need to slow down. The arc is a sustained argument with national mythology about who gets remembered as honourable, who gets labelled a traitor, and how easy it is to turn real atrocities into a cool story about how your people were only ever the tragic victims. And once you see Oda doing that to his own homeland, you're ready for the next step. The way he scales that same argument up to the entire world map of One Piece. And once you see Oda doing that to his own homeland, you're ready for the next step, zooming in on the ugliest corner of that homeland. Because Wano isn't just samurai Japan, it's poison Japan. It's industrial ghost story Japan. Go back to Kuri, those dead grey plains, the skeletal trees, the rivers that literally melt fish on contact. Oda is not being subtle. That's Minamata disease in manga form. That's the post-war chemical boom where corporations dumped mercury into rivers and entire coastal towns paid the price. You're not supposed to see those panels and think, wow, cool wasteland. You're supposed to smell the factory runoff in your head. And here's the thing. It's not an accident that Wano's pollution is concentrated around industry. The smokestacks, the runoff channels, the workers collapsing on the line. This is wartime East Asia run through a shonen filter. You have weapons factories churning out tools for an overseas war effort. And who's actually inside them? Civilians, prisoners, anyone the Raijin can grab. That's not fantasy. That's forced labor in Imperial Japan and in occupied territories, where mines and plants were staffed by people who did not get a vote. I need you to clock how specific this is. The Beast Pirates don't just beat people, they conscript them into production. Udon is a prison and a factory at the same time. That's an intentional fusion of categories: punishment, extraction, militarization. It's the author quietly saying, this is one system, and the community reads it as cool hell gulag level design and moves on. Now, smile fruits. These are one of the darkest pieces of foreshadowing in the whole arc, and not just in the plot sense. They're miracle products sold as progress, superpowers in a bottle, and the side effects are permanent, invisible at first, socially catastrophic later. How is that not a metaphor for toxic goods and propaganda? Cigarettes marketed as healthy, pesticides sold as modernity, national myths sold as pride, that quietly eat your ability to feel anything else. The villagers in Ebisu, stuck grinning through their own suffering, are the punchline to that sales pitch. You consume the thing that was supposed to save you, and now you literally cannot express dissent. That's not just body horror. That's what happens when an entire population is fed a diet of everything is fine, everything is noble, everything is glorious for generations. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is how states tell stories about themselves. And all of this is sitting right under the glossy samurai poster. Wano sells you cherry blossoms, honourable jewels, and cool armour silhouettes. Then it drags you through strip-mined hillsides and villages where the kids drink sludge. The difference between the romanticised surface and the industrial underbelly is the point. Oda is undercutting nationalist nostalgia by showing you who actually pays for that aesthetic. Peasants, workers, collateral. So when fans say Wano is bloated or messy, I get it. But listen to me. In terms of self-critique, this is Oda at his sharpest. He's using fantasy geography to run a full audit on Japan's industrial and wartime history, then filing that audit inside a Saturday morning adventure. And if he's willing to do that to his own country, what do you think he's doing to the rest of the map? Because once we step out of Wano's poisoned borders, the world of One Piece starts looking a lot more familiar and a lot more uncomfortable than most readers are ready to admit. So when we wash up on whole cake and everything is frosting and fondant, I need you to understand this is not Oda taking a break. This is not a palate cleanser arc. This is him weaponizing every European fairy tale you half remember from childhood and asking, hey, what if Hansel and Gretel never escaped the gingerbread house? The Candyland aesthetic is a trap. The houses are edible, the rivers are juice, the trees are candy, and on the surface it feels whimsical. This is fine. This is normal. But here's the thing. In those old stories, the gingerbread house is never just dessert. It's bait. It's a way to lure desperate, starving kids into a system that's going to literally consume them. Whole cake is that on a national scale. Big Mom doesn't just feed you. She owns the ground your hunger walks on. Now zoom in on Big Mom's castle and those tea parties. That isn't generic royalty cosplay. That's Versailles. That's French aristocracy turned up to 11, where the table spreads run on for meters while peasants outside the palace walls are chewing on bark. The homies sing, the porcelain smiles, the cakes are architectural, and it all has that let them eat cake energy that the community loves to meme without realizing Oda is quietly running a history lecture in the background. And then he twists the knife. Big Mom's power is literally control over food and weather. Sun, rain, harvest, famine, all dictated by her mood and her Prometheus-Zeus combo. That is not an accident. That is an author doing intentional political storytelling. Regimes in our world have used grain, rations, and blockades as weapons. You don't need a textbook. You just need to watch Totoland and notice that one woman's appetite is a national security threat. Pattern interrupt. Forget the sweets for a second. Think about the bill. Because in whole cake, the currency is your lifespan. You pay Big Mum in chunks of your remaining years, and she turns those fragments into homies. That is such an on-the-nose metaphor for exploitative systems that I almost feel stupid explaining it. People literally trade their time and vitality for the privilege of not dying today. The land is alive with their stolen souls. It's foreshadowing for how the series treats labor, slavery, and the world government later. Survival as a subscription service. And then, wandering through this Versailles from Hell Disneyland, Oda drops Germa 66 on your head. Marching boots, uniformed children, pseudo-scientific eugenics, goose-stepping castles, a colour palette and insignia set that are very clearly Nazi-adjacent without tripping censorship. Fans joked about Power Rangers, but the planned visual category is World War II militarism. Their presence turns whole cake into a compressed European nightmare. Fairy tales, aristocratic decadence, and wartime fascism all sharing a dinner table. Listen to me, we need to stop treating this arc as the wedding one and start reading it as Oda's thesis on how power dresses itself up. Cute songs, fancy dresses, comic book super soldiers, different skins on the same problem. And if whole cake is his European test case for weaponized abundance, wait until you see what he does with scarcity, revolution, and the rest of the world map. So if whole cake is weaponized abundance, Elbaf is the opposite experiment. What happens when you build an entire nation on weaponized honor? And I need you to clock how long Oda has been seeding this, because the Norse stuff is not a cute aesthetic. It is a planned thesis. We meet it way earlier than Elbaf itself. Dory and Brogy are Oda's first test balloons for what if Vikings but giants. Horned-ish helms, fur trims, massive tankards, roaring feast culture, and this duel-based honor system where they will literally fight for 100 years over a question they forgot. That's not random. That's the author reaching straight into Norse sagas and Germanic folklore and pulling out the romanticized warrior ideal. Drink hard, die well, don't question the code. Here's the thing. When the story keeps calling Elbaf the promised land of giants, It's not just hyping a strong arc, it's hyping a myth. Even the name is a tell. Elbaf is fable reversed. That's Oda waving a road flare and saying, "This is a storybook warrior culture." You're supposed to hear echoes of Valhalla, of Odin's Hall, of those medieval tales where strength is virtue and battle is prayer. It's not subtle. This is intentional branding. And in universe, that branding works. The giants are hyped as the strongest nation in the world. Kids in the community grow up terrified of Elbaf warriors. Big Mom obsesses over their power. The Marines court them. Strength as export. Strength as identity. That reputation is not just cool world building, it's commentary on militaristic cultures that glorify battle as the highest good. When your national myth is, "We are the strongest," what happens to people who are weak, or people who want out? That's the problem Elbaf is built to interrogate. Listen to me. We need to stop treating Elbaf as sick Viking giants, and start seeing it as Oda's sandbox for war guilt. We already have hints. Saul's moral break from O'Hara's destruction, Loki's off-screen political entanglements, Big Mom's catastrophic birthday rampage scarring Elbaf's past. You can feel the shape of the eventual question. What does a warrior nation do when it has to reckon with the bodies stacked underneath its legends? Scandinavian countries have had to reframe their Viking legacy from pure glory to something more complicated. Elbaf is that reckoning in shonen form. And because this is Oda, there's probably going to be old gods in the mix. Sun cults, tree worship, thunder deities. He's been flirting with that whole category of myth since Skypiea. Imagine Elbaf's religion telling them the gods demand endless battle, then the plot forcing them to ask whether the gods were ever real, or just another world government narrative hack. That's not tinfoil. That's consistent with how he's treated Nika, the celestial dragons, and every other divine institution. This is not a sin. This is not overreading. This is how the storytelling works. Oda keeps using mythic races and nations as concentrated archetypes, fishmen for racial hierarchy, Skypiea for colonization and lost civilizations, Wano for isolationist samurai myth. Elbaf is the Norse warrior archetype turned up to 11. And once we map that, we can start mapping the rest of the world. Because Elbaf is not an exception, it's a bridge to the idea that One Piece's entire globe is a distorted mirror of our own. Which means the next step is obvious. We stop at one island and start treating the Grand Line as a full geopolitical map. And once you see where each country is really from, you can't unsee it. So if the map is a warped Earth, we need to zoom out one more level and talk about who's actually sailing on it. Because the Yonko, the Marines, the Warlords, this whole endgame power chart the community treats as game mechanics, that's just the golden age of piracy with the serial numbers filed off. Here's the thing. The Yonko system is not some anime MMO raid tier. It's a cleaned up version of how real pirate lords operated when European empires were busy hoarding trade routes. You had figures who weren't just random raiders, they were regional powers. Bartholomew Roberts controlling swaths of the Atlantic. Henry Morgan going from terror of the Caribbean to a knighted governor. Semi-legitimate warlords whose bases, Tortuga, Nassau, functioned as proto-Yonko territories where states alternated between hunting them and cutting deals. In One Piece, that's Whitebeard's territories, Big Mum's protection suites, Kaido's Wano occupation. These aren't just cool flavor details. They're historically accurate business models. You control ports, you tax merchants, you occasionally negotiate with governments when it's convenient. The flag is criminal, the structure is feudal. This is not a sin, this is normal. Opposite them, the Marines are basically a composite navy built from every empire that ever decided free trade meant our trade or prison. The uniforms and rank obsessions scream British Royal Navy, the classic global patrol force, the guarded merchant convoys and enforced colonial rule in the same breath. But you also get that broader coalition vibe, a world government fleet that's part NATO, part East India Company, part we show up at your island and decide your laws now. Trade protector on the brochure, imperial enforcer in practice. Then you've got the 7 warlords, and I need you to clock how brutally intentional that category is. Historically, when states wanted the benefits of piracy without the PR problem, they handed out letters of marque. Congratulations, you're now a privateer. Same ship, same cannons. Different paperwork. You raid enemy nations. You share the profits, and your sponsoring crown gets plausible deniability when things get war crimes adjacent. That's literally the Shichibukai, Mihawk, Hancock, Crocodile, pirates with state-issued hall passes. The world government outsources violence to criminals, then pretends to be shocked when those criminals have their own agenda, retrofitting morality onto piracy with a stamp and a paycheck. Zoom in further, and Oda's doing character-level foreshadowing of real history. Whitebeard on the Moby Dick, surrounded by suns, is the distilled myth of the benevolent pirate captain, the floating family that shows up in every romantic account of the era. Blackbeard is a walking Edward Teach remix. The name, the chaotic ambition, the sense that he's weaponizing the pirate brand as much as the cannons. Shanks is the opposite vector, the modern pop culture pirate. Red-haired, cool coat, drinks, laughs, shows up to end wars with a speech. He's every poster on a teenager's wall that says freedom in cursive. Listen to me. Once you see these parallels, the power balance stops feeling invented and starts reading as commentary. Pirates, Yonko, warlords, marines, they're not 4 separate systems. They're one tangled ecosystem of states and outlaws, constantly cutting deals, betraying each other and pretending they're on opposite sides. And if Oda is this precise about the surface level history, what happens when we follow that thread down into the void century itself? And when you follow that thread, you run face first into the biggest stitched together monster in the series, the world government. I need you to understand this. Oda didn't design one empire. He designed a group project of every empire that ever existed, turned in late, covered in blood, and stamped for peace. Start with the origin story. 20 kingdoms band together, crush an unnamed superpower, and then write the history books so they're the heroes. That's not just fantasy geopolitics. That's the Holy Alliance after Napoleon. That's the League of Nations. That's the early United Nations. But with actual teeth and zero shame. Those real coalitions were supposed to prevent chaos, but always bent toward preserving the existing elites. The world government just drops the PR filter. The celestial dragons literally ride slaves through the capital. The mask is gone, the function is the same. Here's the thing, Mary Y is doing so much work visually that fans stop reading it politically. The sprawling palaces and geometric gardens scream Versailles, absolute monarch France at its most decadent. The religious iconography, the Holy Land branding, the Pope-adjacent vibes of the Gorosei, that's Vatican City and broader European theocracy baked straight into the architecture. You get stained glass holiness and gold-trimmed cruelty in the same frame. It's the spiritual authority of a church fused with the material excess of an aristocracy, and the author is very intentional about that blend. Functionally, the world government is not just an empire, it's a meta-empire. It doesn't annex every island, it outsources control to member states, then coordinates the violence. That's the scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference, the colonial-era meetings where European powers sat around a table and carved up continents they'd never seen. Reverie is literally that conference room, just with more drip and more birds. And Reverie is where the storytelling goes from fun evil counsel to, oh, this is uncomfortably real. Kings and queens from powerful nations gather, toast world peace, then debate whether to erase entire islands or ignore slave trafficking, because it's inconvenient. That's every G7, every great power summit where humanitarian language becomes cover for resource grabs and regime changes. This is not a sin in terms of writing. This is Oda showing you, very calmly, how power talks when the cameras are off. Pattern interrupt. Notice what's missing. There is no One Piece equivalent of a small neutral country walking in and setting the agenda. The weak states are props. Their tragedies are agenda items. And the community in universe treats that as normal. This is fine. This is normal. That's the horror. So when fans try to pin the world government to one reference, oh, it's just Rome, or it's just the UN with swords, they're missing the category it actually sits in. It's a greatest hits compilation of imperial behaviour. Roman senates and roads, European courts and cathedrals, colonial conferences, modern blue flag diplomacy, all remixed into one machine. And if the machine is that historically dense on the surface, what does that say about the missing century it's so desperate to erase? And if the machine is that historically dense, you have to ask, who's sitting at the top of it? Who gets to enjoy all that imperial infrastructure without ever touching the ground it's built on? Enter the celestial dragons, the part of One Piece where Oda stops being subtle and just starts screaming in Versailles cosplay. Visually, these people are a joke. The space helmets, the beaded veils, the ridiculous embroidery that looks less fashion and more my curtains achieve sentience. But listen to me, that joke is doing work. Those helmets are a grotesque exaggeration of European courts and colonial elites who literally insulated themselves from the air, the smells, the bodies of the people they exploited. It's Versailles, it's plantation houses, it's the kind of aristocracy where you don't walk in the street because the street is for them. Here's the thing, Oda doesn't stop at costumes. He weaponizes posture. Human chairs, slaves on leashes, explosive collars. This is not random cartoon villain aesthetic. This is plantation slavery, caste systems, Roman triumphs with prisoners dragged behind the chariot, all collapsed into one horrifying visual. When Charlos is carried through Sabaudi on a living throne, that's a direct echo of how entire classes have historically been demoted to furniture, not people, infrastructure, and the collars are doing double duty. On the surface, they're sci-fi shock devices. Underneath, they're iron chains, branded skin, caste marks, passbooks. They're every bureaucratic and physical tool used to say, in very clear writing, you are property. You exist in a different category of human, and the category is tool. Now, we need to talk about the rule. Don't touch the celestial dragons. Not don't harm civilians. Not respect the law. A specific bloodline is untouchable. That's not fantasy. That is the most boringly real part of the story. You've had royal families, colonial officers, slave owners, party officials, all functionally above the law, because the law was written to protect them, not constrain them. The Marines panicking when Luffy punches Charlos is exactly that. The system glitching because someone treated a god as a guy. Charlos shooting at people in Sabaudi is not a quirky gag. It's lynching. It's public colonial violence. It's the slave owner firing into a crowd to make an example. The point isn't the individual death. The point is the spectacle that tells everyone else, remember your place, or this happens to you. When a slave's collar explodes in front of the crowd, that's terror as policy, not random cruelty, and I need you to see how intentional this is. Oda is not riffing on one era. He's building a composite monster out of European nobility, Atlantic slave traders, caste aristocracies, even modern oligarchs who inherit impunity. The celestial dragons are his most vicious indictment of hereditary privilege in the entire story. If the world government is the machine, they're the beneficiaries who never have to touch the gears, which raises a problem the story has been quietly foreshadowing for years. If this is what the gods look like, what kind of sin did the ancient kingdom commit to be erased for opposing them? So if the celestial dragons are the ugliest possible endpoint of hereditary power, then Dragon is the narrative recoil. He's the world snapping back. But listen to me. Oda doesn't just toss in a rebellion because every shonen needs a cool, edgy faction. He wires Dragon's revolutionary army straight into a very specific category of real-world history. Here's the thing. The Revolutionary Army is not a bunch of heroic Avengers with a shared HQ and matching merch. It's cells, it's scattered bases, embedded agents, and local uprisings that suddenly sync up. That's textbook modern guerrilla strategy, from Latin American insurgencies to anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia. You have commanders embedded in kingdoms, you have information networks, you have coordinated strikes on supply lines and symbols of power rather than open field battles. This is not a coincidence. It's intentional storytelling. When Oda shows you burning flags, toppled castles and crowds flooding the streets as kings are dragged from thrones, he's not improvising revolutionary aesthetics from scratch. He's remixing the French Revolution's storming of the Bastille, the Russian Revolution's Red October, and every grainy newsreel of statues pulled down in the 20th century. The liberated kingdoms in One Piece visually rhyme with Paris in 1789 or Petrograd in 1917. Flags torn down, new banners raised, the old order humiliated in public so everyone understands the regime change is real. Dragon himself is where the foreshadowing of Oda's historical homework gets loud. The cloak, the scars, the permanent storm cloud over his head. He's coded as the archetypal revolutionary. But I need you to resist the pattern-seeking monkey brain that wants to see, oh, he's just Che, or he's clearly Lenin, and file him in a single category. His rhetoric about oppressed peoples and corrupt world nobles borrows from Marxist-inspired revolutionaries. Sure, but his operational style, slow, patient, building alliances with former slaves and minor nations, feels closer to pragmatic anti-imperial leaders who spend decades organizing before they ever fire a shot. And Oda does something very intentional with the moral framing. The world government calls Dragon the worst criminal in the world. Posters label his people terrorists. This is not a sin. This is normal. Historically, every successful revolution has worn both masks at different times, depending on who's writing the press release. Liberation for some, chaos for others. The French Revolution ends with a republic and a reign of terror. The Russian Revolution promises workers' rights and delivers gulags. Anti-colonial wars free nations and also leave power vacuums and civil wars. Oda mirrors that tension by letting us see Dragon's people freeing slaves, while the narrative keeps reminding us, revolutions burn things that don't grow back. So no, One Piece isn't just yelling freedom good, government bad into the void. It's staging a long-planned conversation about revolution and counter-revolution, about who gets to define order and what gets broken to build something new. And if Dragon is the storm, we need to ask, what exactly is he trying to resurrect from the Void Century's ruins? Because the answer to that might be far scarier than the world government he's trying to destroy. So when Dragon is trying to resurrect something from the Void Century, we need to pause and ask a more uncomfortable question. What does it mean for an entire century to be missing? Not metaphorically, literally gone. 100-year hole in the world's memory is not an accident, it's policy. And here's the thing. That policy has very real, very ugly precedents in our own history. The Void Century is basically the ultimate state-sponsored redaction. In One Piece, every official record just politely skips 100 years, the same way your uncle forgets to mention the war crimes part of his military stories. In reality, regimes have done this forever. Pharaonic Egypt chiseling out a rival's cartouche, new dynasties in China rewriting chronicles to make the last guys look incompetent. Conquerors don't just win battles, they win the edit. Rome literally had a term for this, damnatio memoriae. You fall out of favour with the emperor, and suddenly your statues are smashed, your name is scratched off inscriptions, your portraits get the ancient equivalent of a blur filter. The person still existed, obviously, but the state is trying to brute force a patch over reality. That's exactly the energy of the world government toward the ancient kingdom. They were never here. Do not perceive them. And if you zoom out, it gets worse. Book burnings under Qin Shi Huang in China, the Nazis feeding libraries into bonfires, colonial powers destroying or looting codices and records from Mesoamerican civilizations, and indigenous cultures worldwide. Oda doesn't have to invent a playbook for Ohara's Buster Call. He just copies and pastes from history, then turns the dial up to 11 so fans can't pretend it's subtle. Because listen to me, the ancient kingdom is not framed as some goofy lost Atlantis. All the canon hints scream technologically advanced, ideologically inconvenient. The giant straw hat, the enormous city ruins, the implication that they had weapons or energy sources the current era can't replicate. That's not fantasy. That's how victors always talk about the people they erased. Dangerous heretics. Threat to order. Too free. You don't obliterate a civilization for being mid. You obliterate it because its existence is a problem for your narrative. And the narrative enforcers? In One Piece, that's the treatment of archaeologists. Clover, Robin, the entire Ohara community get classified as criminals for doing reading, not for building weapons, for studying history. I need you to clock how intentional that is. In our world, scholars, journalists, and activists who dig up mass graves, expose genocides, or challenge nationalist myths get jailed, disappeared, or smeared as traitors. This is not a sin of fiction. This is normal for power. Pattern interrupt. The Void Century is not just a mystery box for foreshadowing nerds to theory craft around. It's Oda grabbing you by the collar and yelling, "Your history books are political documents." The world government curates, censors, and weaponizes the past to justify its present. Our governments do the same, just with nicer fonts and fewer laser beams. So when we chase clues about Joy Boy and the Ancient Kingdom, we're not only decoding One Piece's plot, we're rehearsing a skill, reading around the erasures. And that's going to matter even more once we get to how Oda maps his entire world onto our own globe, turning every island into a distorted mirror of a real country you thought you understood. And nowhere is that more obvious than with the single dumbest, most important letter in the entire series. We need to talk about the D. Not the fruit powers, not the ancient weapons, the middle initial that turns every introduction into a political crime scene. Because in One Piece, that D is not just a cool mystery tag, it's a taboo surname, a heretical clan marker, the kind of thing whole regimes have historically tried to erase from census records. Here's the thing, in our world, this has a category. You've had crypto-Jews under the Spanish Inquisition, conversos who publicly converted to Christianity but privately kept Jewish rites. You've had hidden Christians in Edo, Japan doing the same maneuver with underground crosses and rebranded saints. You've had entire families in fascist states quietly burying their real last names because that name meant enemy of the people. Oda is not improvising this. He's pulling from a very intentional political pattern. When you look at the Will of D, you're basically looking at a persecuted surname speedrun. The world government treats that initial the way authoritarian regimes treat dangerous bloodlines that might revive banned ideologies or rival dynasties. It's not just, oh no, they're strong. It's, oh no, this name carries a memory we worked very hard to delete. That's Void Century paranoia distilled into one letter, and the behavior matches. Think about how the D carriers are scattered, fragmented, often ignorant of their own history. That's Crypto Identity 101. Luffy grows up with no clue what it means. Law gets a half-whispered explanation from Corazon. Robin only hears about it through forbidden archaeology. This is how persecuted lineages actually survive. In rumour, in half-remembered stories, in the gaps where the official textbooks go silent. Now, because this is Oda, he folds in Japanese ancestral logic too. The idea that will passes down is straight out of ancestor veneration. The dead aren't gone. They're obligations you inherit. But he tweaks the trope. This is not some pure-blood chosen one nonsense. The Will of D isn't foreshadowing a midi-chlorian chart. It's about inheriting a stance, a refusal, a smile in the face of execution. The bloodline is a continuity of ideals, not a genetic power-up. I need you to notice how often the story separates the name from biology. Ace is a D by spirit even before you know his real surname. Law isn't related to Luffy, but he's in the same narrative category. That's Oda yelling that what matters is the will you pick up, not the DNA you share. This is not a sin. This is him dodging the worst parts of Chosen One's storytelling while still using all its emotional weight. So when the community treats the Will of D as a pure mystery box, what does the D stand for? We miss the point. The reveal isn't going to be satisfying because it's a clever crossword answer. It's going to be satisfying because it locks this political metaphor into place. Names as both curse and sacrament, as something tyrants fear and martyrs protect. And once you see that, you start asking a scarier question. If a single letter can be that radioactive, what happens when Oda writes entire islands as outlawed names on the map? So if islands are outlawed names on the map, devil fruits are the banned dictionaries. They're the contraband language of power. And Oda doesn't start from zero there. He reaches straight into the oldest story in the book. You bite the fruit, you gain knowledge, and God personally nerfs your life. In Genesis, the Tree of Knowledge is the original power-up with a catch. You eat, you level up in awareness, and you get kicked out of paradise. With devil fruits, Oda hardwires that same theology into game design. You gain fire, lightning, rubber, Buddha shockwaves, whatever, and in exchange you lose the ability to swim in a world that is 90% ocean. That's not just a quirky balance patch, that's a curse. The sea itself becomes this offended deity, dragging down anyone who dared to reach for forbidden power. You didn't just cheat the system now hates you. And here's the thing, the individual fruits are basically a global myth buffet. Mirror, mirror, no me. That's Prometheus stealing fire and paying for it. Goro Goro no Mi turns Enel into an off-brand Zeus, hurling lightning from a sky island that already screams angry god complex. Zoan transformations are werewolves, Kitsune Tanuki, Hanuman whole bestiaries of shapeshifters, boiled into a taxonomy. Logias hand out element control straight from Greek, Norse and Japanese storytelling. Sand tyrants, ice admirals, magma demons. The Powers readers a remix of every time a human being told a story and went, what if that guy controlled storms? But then you hit the Gomu Gomu, sorry, Hito Hito no Mi, Nika, and the mask just comes off. Luffy's fruit isn't random rubber. It's a sun god model, a liberation deity whose whole deal is freeing slaves and laughing in the face of empire. That's Afro-Caribbean trickster energy. That's a Nancy and Alegua and Brer Rabbit. That's every colonized folk hero who weaponizes joy and cartoon physics against authority. When Gear 5 turns him into a white-haired, drumming, grinning chaos engine, the story is screaming at you. This is a god of drums, dance, and uprisings. And I need you to see how intentional that is. The silliest power in the series was always wired into the most serious religious imagery. Now, zoom out, the way devil fruits are scattered, named, and classified, that's not random either. You've got a world government, pirate emperors, and shadow brokers all racing to catalogue these exotic resources, hoard them, weaponize them. That's straight up colonial science. It's the age of exploration, but with fruit instead of spices, and people as the shipping containers. The categories Paramecia, Zoan, Logia read like a bureaucrat's field guide to the supernatural. So devil fruits become Oda's masterstroke. He turns an entire planet's worth of myths, gods, and religious symbols into a coherent tradable power system. Not just foreshadowing future battles, but foreshadowing the politics of who gets to own miracle stories. And if the fruits are this curated, this planned, what does that say about the one thing in this world that isn't supposed to be eaten at all? And that do not eat warning on the One Piece world isn't just about a fruit. It's about people. Because listen to me, Oda doesn't only turn myths into commodities, he turns entire races into resources. And that's where the real world references get uncomfortable on purpose. Start with the giants. On the surface, they're Norse 101, Elbaf as a Viking warrior culture, longships, honor duels, the whole die-in-battle ethos. That's not random flavor, that's the author grabbing a very specific mythic category, the Jotnar, the giant clans of Norse legend, and then asking, what happens when a world government sees these people and goes, oh perfect, walking siege weapons? We see it with the Marines courting Elbaf, with Big Mom's obsession. Their culture is rich and specific, but the outside world reduces them to muscle for hire. Minks get the same treatment from a different myth pool. They're basically a curated remix of Japanese yokai, Bakaneko, Kitsune, Tanuki, plus global beast folk traditions from Egyptian animal-headed gods to European werbeasts. The fur, the tribal drums, the electro powers, all that is fun world building. But here's the thing, to the broader community of humans in One Piece, the minks are exotic trophies. They're that mysterious tribe adventurers talk about in colonial travelogues. Even their home, Zoo, is literally ridden around on a giant animal, turned into a moving spectacle. Then you hit fishmen and merfolk, and Oda just rips the subtlety filter off. These aren't vague metaphors. This is segregation, slavery, and racist violence in a sea creature skin. Merfolk come from global siren and mermaid myths. Fishmen pull from everything from Japanese Ningyo to Western sea monsters. But the storytelling is direct. A separate district under the Red Line. Chains in the Holy Land. A queen preaching coexistence and getting murdered for it. Fishman Island isn't foreshadowing racism. It's racism with the serial numbers filed off. Pattern interrupt. And then he invents a race that the story itself insists is already extinct. Lunarians. Suddenly we're dealing with angel/demon hybrids with black wings, white hair, and literal fire on their backs. That's fallen angel territory. That's Zoroastrian fire symbolism. That's every cursed bloodline in fantasy and real history rolled into one. King isn't just a cool design. He's a walking archive of persecution, hunted down to be experimented on, dissected, priced. Notice the through line. Giants are recruited as soldiers. Fishmen and merfolk are bought and sold as slaves. Lunarians become science projects with bounties on their biology. Even the minks, while less industrially exploited, get treated as rare curiosities whose loyalty or mysterious powers can be leveraged. The races are not just different, they are harvestable. And I need you to see how intentional that is. Oda is not doing fantasy racism, because every shonen needs an oppression subplot. This is not a sin, this is not lazy writing. He's externalizing real-world systems. Colonial armies built on subject peoples, enslaved groups treated as capital, indigenous cultures turned into zoo exhibits by blowing them up into mythic forms so you can't look away. We need to stop reading these races as just cool designs and start clocking how the world reacts to them, because that reaction is the point. And once you see that, you're ready for the next step, how the map itself, the seas and islands these people are pushed onto, quietly mirrors our own history of empire. And once you see the map as empire, you have to talk about the gods those empires try to erase. Because here's the thing, One Piece doesn't just have a sun god for aesthetics. It has a sun god that behaves suspiciously close to real-world deities born under chains. When the story finally names Nika, what do we get? A laughing, dancing figure of liberation whose worship is banned, whose name is a crime. That is very, very close to the way Afro-Caribbean religions developed under slavery. Enslaved Africans in the Caribbean fused West African deities with Catholic saints and indigenous spirits. You get Vodou, Santeria, Candomblé. You pray to St. Peter on the surface, but everyone in the room knows you're actually talking to Ogun. That's not a coincidence-shaped cloud. That's intentional storytelling about syncretic survival. I need you to clock how Nika functions in that same category. The world government slaps a fake label on Luffy's fruit, buries the name Nika, and pushes an official theology of God in Maria Joie. On paper, there is only the empty throne and the nobles who rule by heaven. In practice, oppressed people whisper about a different sun, a different joy, a different future. That is how hidden gods work in colonized spaces. Now run that lens back to Skypiea. Oda draws Shandora with stepped pyramids, sun disks, feathered motifs. The Shandians are sky warriors guarding a golden city. The god of Skypiea lives in the clouds, demands obedience, drops judgment from above. That's already a riff on Mesoamerican sun and sky worship, mixed with the way European colonizers painted those religions as savage and demonic. Historically, Aztec and Maya rituals get reduced to a gore highlight reel, so the conquest reads as salvation. In Skypiea, Enel literally calls himself God, brands the Shandians as heretics, and weaponizes divine punishment to justify genocide. The visual language is Mesoamerican. The PR campaign is colonial. This is not a sin. This is not overreading. This is how the author folds history into fantasy. And listen to me, because this is the part fans undersell. Oppressed groups have always used joy, dance, and ecstatic worship as quiet resistance. Ring shouts among enslaved Africans in the Americas, capoeira masquerading as dance, drum circles that double as encrypted meetings. You smile, you move, you survive. Nika's fighting style is that principle turned into a rubber cartoon. The more he laughs, the freer he becomes. So when the world government suppresses Nika myths, bans certain dances, erases certain drums, that mirrors real attempts to outlaw voodoo ceremonies, indigenous rituals, anything that gave colonized people independent spiritual power. You elevate the state-approved church, you criminalize the gods of the plantation and the jungle. We need to recognize that pattern, or we're just pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast and call it foreshadowing. Which brings us to Luffy's so-called Gear 5 power-up. Read purely as shonen escalation. It's fun. This is fine. This is normal. But the moment you plug it into this global tradition of liberation theologies, sun gods of slaves, sky gods of conquered nations, it stops being a random cartoon mode and becomes Oda planting his protagonist in the same mythic soil as every banned, danced, whispered god of the oppressed. And once your main character is literally powered by that tradition, you can start asking a much scarier question. What happens when that god finally reaches the capital? So when that god of the oppressed finally staggers into the capital, singing and laughing, you know what he sounds like? He sounds like a drunk skeleton with a violin belting Bink's Sakoff key. And listen to me. That is not random comic relief. That is Oda weaponizing music history. Here's the thing. Binks' Seiki is not a J-pop insert song that wandered onto a pirate ship by accident. Structurally, it's a sea shanty. Simple melody, repetitive chorus, easy call and response. It's written so anyone on deck, in any language, can latch onto the rhythm and scream sing it while hauling ropes, or in Brooks' case, dying horribly for the narrative. That's what shanties were, work songs that turned miserable, dangerous labour into something communal and bearable. And then you look at the Rumbar Pirates. I need you to clock that name. Rumbar is doing double duty. On the nose, it's rum plus bar, Caribbean-coded alcohol and music. Underneath, it's pointing straight at the historical rum trade routes in the West Indies, where sugar, molasses, and rum were literally the economic engine of colonial empires and pirate legends. These are not generic anime pirates. This crew is drenched in Caribbean maritime culture before Brook even opens his mouth. Historically, ships and port cities were noisy on purpose. You had sailors from West Africa, Europe, the Caribbean, Asia, all crammed together with no shared grammar, so the workaround was rhythm. Drums, fiddles, chorus hooks. You get work shanties on deck, you get calypso and mento, and early jazz in the bars, and suddenly you have a community that can't speak but can still sing. Binks Seiki is doing that exact job in the story. It's the song that crosses languages, oceans, and then, because Oda is an overachiever, time and death. Brook's entire backstory is a case study. The Rumbar pirates use this one song to bond with Laboon, to keep morale up, to die to. Then Brook resurrects as a skeleton, and the song keeps going. That's not just sad, that is the most on-the-nose memento mori you could ask for. Remember death, but also remember to bring the backing track. Brook himself is a mashup reference. Skeleton musician, that's medieval memento mori art and Dia de los Muertos style imagery colliding with jazz and blues traditions that constantly flirt with death. Skull rings, graveyard album covers, Saint, James Infirmary blues. Death is terrifying, so musicians turn it into a joke you can dance to. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is in fact how whole musical genres process generational trauma. And Oda folds that into a single character who cracks bone puns, plays classical, drops jazz riffs, and treats his own corpse body as a gag. That's Afro-Caribbean and Black Atlantic music logic baked into shonen. You mourn, you joke, you keep the rhythm moving. The author is not just tossing a catchy track on the OST, he's pulling from a deep, intentional well of maritime and diasporic culture, which raises a quieter, nastier question we need to sit with. If even the background song is this historically loaded, what else in this cartoon world is hiding a whole erased ocean of real history under the melody? So if even the soundtrack is doing geopolitics, we need to talk about the guy in the suit kicking people over soup. Because Sanji is Oda's other secret map, not of borders, but of taste buds. Here's the thing, from the moment you meet him at the Bharati, the series is screaming continental Europe at you, floating restaurant, gaudy figurehead, Zeph in a toque, menus that read more French-Italian than anything remotely East Blue. That whole arc is Oda grabbing haute cuisine, slapping it on the Grand Line and saying, yes, this is a pirate ship, but it's also a 3-star Michelin you can't afford. Sanji plating delicate seafood courses in the middle of a Don Krieg siege is not random, it's a visual shorthand for French brigade kitchens and Italian trattoria hospitality weaponized against starvation and violence. Then you jump to Whole Cake Island, and it's that turned up to 11. Toto-land is literally a patisserie nation state. Sanji's arranged marriage is staged through cream puffs and wedding cakes that look straight out of a Versailles fever dream. The author is pulling from European pastry tradition, croquembouche towers, millefeuille layers, fondant monstrosities, and folding it into Big Mom's soft power. You do not conquer with tanks, you conquer with sugar tariffs and tea parties. The story is using food as diplomacy, and the community just nods because it's pretty. This is normal. But Sanji's repertoire is not a narrow French guy joke. He's constantly cooking dishes that map to East Asia, the Mediterranean, and everywhere in between. You see stir-fries and rice bowls that read as Chinese and Japanese technique, wok-style high heat, knife work on vegetables, ramen-style broths. You see paella-coated seafood skillets and olive oil-heavy pastas that scream Spain and Italy more than generic anime chow. Even the way he butchers giant sea kings, portioning aging, stop making tracks with real culinary school methodology. None of that is accidental set dressing. It's intentional world building through mise en place. Pattern interrupt, Sanji kicking a guy for wasting food. That's not just a he's nice trait. That's foreign policy. Inside One Piece, sharing a meal is the basic unit of alliance. Bharati feeding enemies, Sanji feeding Gin. The crew's banquet scenes after every arc, these are ritualized peace treaties. Food signals culture, hospitality, and who counts as human. In the real world, states do this with banquets and state dinners. In One Piece, pirates do it with curry on deck. And then you have the all blue. I need you to stop treating that as a quirky side dream. The all blue is literally globalized cuisine as shonen prophecy. One ocean where every fish from every sea mingles, where scarcity evaporates and borders stop mattering because the ingredients do not respect your map. That is a fantasy of decolonized trade, of cultural exchange without gatekeeping. Sanji's dream is, what if every refugee kid could cook anything from anywhere because the world finally mixed? So yes, Sanji is comic relief, cigarette nosebleed, horny disaster. This is fine. But he's also Oda's lighter, warmer proof of concept. If you can imagine a kitchen where every culture's ingredients coexist, you can imagine a world where the world government's artificial borders are optional. And once you see that, you start asking a nastier question. If even the soup course is arguing for a different political order, what on earth is the land itself trying to tell you? And here's where the conspiracy brain really kicks in. Because if the soup is arguing politics, the outfits, accents, and dumb background posters are running a whole parallel lecture you've probably been skimming past on your way to the punchlines. I need you to think about Dressrosa for a second. Not the birdcage, not the toys. The clothes. Viola's flamenco-esque dress. The frilled sleeves. The roses. The matador jackets on random guards who never matter again. That's not just Spanish aesthetic DLC. That's Oda dressing an entire island in the visual grammar of bullfights and fiestas, so that when a coliseum of blood sport shows up, your brain has already filed it under a very specific real-world category. Same thing with Wano. This is where fans go, oh, it's Japan, we get it, and then clock out. But listen to me. The kimono patterns, the hakama silhouettes, the way even background extras are wearing regional feeling variations, that's costume design as world building. When Kinemon is stuck in that goofy punk outfit on Punk Hazard, it only lands as a gag because we've been trained to see him as a walking bundle of Edo period tropes. The foreshadowing is sewn into the fabric. Literally. Water 7 does it in the opposite direction. You get the Venetian worker gear. Overalls, caps, tool belts, those striped undershirts on the shipwrights. They're not pirates, they're union guys. And then you notice the gondoliers, the canals, the way even the cops feel more carabinieri than marines. The author is quietly telling you this is an Italian labour city before anyone opens their mouth. Except then, they open their mouths. And here's the thing, Oda doesn't just colour palette the islands. He codes them linguistically. Dressrosa is packed with Spanish-influenced names. Doflamingo, Viola, Diamante, Pica, Riku Dold. Water 7 leans Italian. Galila, Iceberg, Khalifa, Lucci, Bluno, Corgi, Baratti and Whole Cake lean French in both naming and food terminology. So when Sanji drops a millefeuille or consommé, it's not just chef flexing, it's deliberate linguistic tagging. This is not a sin. This is not Oda stereotyping lazily. This is planned shorthand. You hear the name, you see the outfit, your brain pulls up a whole folder of historical and cultural associations the story can then weaponize. And if you're a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, the background art is where you fully lose it. Dressrosa streets are plastered with faux Spanish signage, curvy fonts and posters that gesture toward real Romance scripts. Wano's banners mimic brush calligraphy strokes. Water 7's shop signs use chunky, touristy Italian fonts you'd see on a cheap pizza box. None of this matters to the plot. All of it matters to the illusion that this world is mapped to ours. Then there are the running gags and bit characters, the overdramatic bullfighters and matadors in Dressrosa, the overworked gondoliers in Water 7, the stoic hypercoded samurai in Wano. These are caricatures, sure, but they never break the internal logic. This is fine. This is normal for parody. The joke only lands because the reference is precise. So when fans say, Oda is just loosely inspired by real places. That's the problem. No. The micro details prove the opposite. He is building a layered, internally consistent global parody where even a throwaway sign or apron is doing geopolitical cosplay. And once you accept that, we need to talk about what happens when he stops joking and starts rewriting entire wars. When he stops joking and starts rewriting entire wars. And before we go there, we need to talk about us. You, me, the community. Because we are pattern-seeking monkeys. You give us a map, a flag, and 3 colours, and suddenly we're seeing definitive proof that this one-panel tavern is based on our hometown kebab shop. We see Jesus in toast, national flags in random colour palettes, and foreshadowing in every vaguely round object that could, in theory, be a Gear 7. Here's the thing. This is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal. Your brain is supposed to connect dots. The problem is when we pretend every squiggle is a dot that Oda intentionally put there. So I need you to have a little checklist in your head before you declare X island is obviously based on Y country, or this is clearly a reference to Z-War. First criterion, explicit author comment. If Oda or the data books go, yeah, Alabaster is Egypt, Dressrosa is Spain, Water 7 is Venice, that's game over. That's not a theory, that's a citation. Second, multiple aligned visual and thematic cues. Not one pyramid, a desert kingdom, crocodiles, ancient tombs, royal regalia, names that echo Arabic, and a narrative about control of a river that functions as a Nile analogue. Third, consistent naming and language. Dressrosa isn't just kinda European. It has Spanish-inflected names, flamenco fashion, bullfighting arenas, and a hot-blooded revolutionary plot. Fourth, narrative function. What role does this place or event play in the story? And does that role echo the real-world reference in a meaningful way? Now contrast that with the overreach we see all the time. This island has snow, so it's obviously Canada. This guy has a top hat, so he's clearly Abraham Lincoln. You've seen these posts. I've made some of these posts. The entire argument rests on one shared trait and vibes. No author comment, no cluster of matching details, no narrative parallel. That's not a strong reference category. That's you being a pattern-seeking monkey who really wants your country to be in one piece. Listen to me. This is not a moral failing. It's fan behaviour. It becomes a problem when we start citing those headcanons as evidence of Oda's genius world-building or deliberate foreshadowing. If your "this island is Germany" theory boils down to "there's a beer stein in the background," that doesn't meet the standard. It's fun, but it's not planned. Compare that to Alabaster or Dressrosa. Those are slam dunks. Oda has literally said they're modelled on Egypt and Spain. The architecture, clothing, food, language quirks, even the political arcs line up. An oppressed desert kingdom fighting over a vital river. A flamboyant, tyrannical ruler toppled in a very Spanish-coded revolution. The evidence isn't one trait. It's a stack. Pattern interrupt. Not everything has to be a reference. Sometimes a hat is just a hat. Sometimes a random town is just generic fantasy Europe, because the author needed a backdrop and had a deadline. So here's the deal. Speculate. Go wild. Draw maps. Connect threads. Ship your favourite "this island is my city" theories, but be honest with yourself about the category. When it's a fun headcanon, call it that. When it's a likely intentional reference, you'll know because it passes the checklist, and usually Oda eventually admits it. And once we clean that up, we can finally talk about the real-world wars and atrocities Oda is absolutely referencing on purpose. So now that we've separated "this island is my city" headcanon from actual evidence, we need to talk about the other monster in the room, the cult of genius Oda master plan. I need you to hear this without pausing the video to type an angry comment in all caps. When you treat every coincidence, every later developed idea as proof that Oda had a 1,000 chapter corkboard mapped from day one, you're not complimenting him. You're flattening what he actually does well. Here's the thing. Oda is absurdly planned. The Void Century, the Will of D, the ancient weapons, that whole pre-writing argument from earlier, that's real. But there's a difference between this author pre-wrote the spine of the story and this author knew in 1997 that Dressrosa would be fantasy Spain with a gladiator toy revolution framed around a Shichibukai who is also a fallen. Celestial Dragon. One is disciplined storytelling. The other is you and me, pattern-seeking monkeys seeing Jesus in toast. When the community insists that every real-world reference was secretly intentional from Chapter 1, it erases iterative creativity. It pretends Oda isn't a human being reacting to history, to new research, to his own changing interests. Dressrosa's Spanish flair, corridor coliseum, bullfighting motifs. That screams an author who, years into serialization, fell in love with a specific aesthetic and then threaded it into the existing political structure of the world government and the celestial dragons. That's not a 1997 prophecy. That's 2010 S. Oda doing high-level retrofitting. And this is not a sin. This is normal. This is how long-form writing works. In SBS and interviews, he's admitted plenty of things were decided later. He said he originally thought of Sanji as a gunslinger before pivoting to a cook, then decades later folds in Germa 66, North Blue and European war aesthetics. And suddenly the Vinsmokes feel like they were planned from his first Mr. Prince line. He's admitted he didn't have every Shichibukai fleshed out at the start. Yet Kuma's design and Bible eventually mesh perfectly with the Revolutionary Army and the whole tyrant-turned weapon of the world government theme. Is it really less impressive that he didn't have Kuma's tragic backstory pinned up in 1990, or is it more impressive that he can look at the existing categories, world government oppression, religious imagery, real-world dictatorships, and retrofit a character so cleanly that fans swear it was always there? That's the craft I need you to notice. Flexibility, thematic consistency, research depth. When you worship an imaginary omniscient plan, you downgrade all of that to, oh, he just knew. No, he didn't just know. He read. He watched the news. He learned more history. He layered in Versailles and Vatican echoes into Mariageois. He sharpened parallels to slavery, colonialism, and real revolutions. The magic trick isn't that he predicted his future self. The magic trick is that his future self keeps honoring the original blueprint while adding new real-world references that feel inevitable. And if you think that's impressive, wait until we get to the wars and atrocities he's clearly pulling from on purpose, because some of those parallels are uncomfortably specific. And here's where it stops being cute trivia and starts punching you in the throat. When you watch Robin scream, "I want to live," at Eni's lobby, it already wrecks you. You don't need a degree to cry there. But listen to me. The second you clock that her entire island was wiped out for studying a forbidden century, that's not just fantasy. That's a mashup of real regimes that erased languages, burned libraries, and disappeared academics. Suddenly that scene isn't just about one traumatized archaeologist. It's about every historian who ever got silenced for asking the wrong questions. Same thing with Fishman Island. On a first watch, Fisher Tiger's death is tragic. He freed slaves, he refused human blood, he died stubborn. Cool. Heroic martyr. Then you realize Oda is very intentionally coding the Fishman-human conflict with civil rights and slavery imagery, branded backs, segregated districts, peaceful protest versus violent revolt. Now Jinbei's speeches about hatred and inherited pain stop sounding abstract and start sounding eerily close to actual civil rights leaders, trying to steer their communities between forgiveness and fury. The Sun Pirate's scars go from pirate branding detail to this is generational trauma etched into skin. Otohime's assassination hits the same nerve. At first, she's the idealistic queen who gets shot. We've seen that trope. But once you map her onto pacifist activists who were murdered to derail reform movements, that panel of her blood on the ground becomes a planned political hit. Not random tragedy. The author is not improvising a sad backstory. He's pulling from a category of real history where charismatic bridge builders get removed so the cycle of hate can continue. Sabo 2. Rich kid, garbage parents, runs away to be free. Fun adventure template, right? Except his noble background, the Goa Kingdom's cast trash pit, the world noble ship he's shot down for approaching, all start reading as a very intentional indictment of aristocracies that literally burn the poor out of sight. I need you to see how different that feels once you recognize the pattern. Dressrosa is the same medicine, just with a louder flavor. On paper, it's evil warlord toys with a kingdom, citizens revolt, big punch credits. This is fine as a surface story, but once you see the Franquist Spain coding, the disappearances, the propaganda, the enforced amnesia, the toys as metaphor for dehumanized labor, the birdcage as a visual police state, the uprising stops being a generic crowd shot and starts echoing real anti-dictatorship movements clawing their way back to memory. And all of this loops back to the Void Century. The Eurasia parallels are not subtle. Lost Kingdom banned research, a world government that literally criminalizes history. Robin's entire life's work stops being a quirky hobby for lore nerds and becomes part of a global struggle for historical truth. Every poneglyph she reads is an act of resistance. Every time the community memes history nerd Robin, we're also accidentally pointing at the core of the political plot. Here's the thing. Once you start seeing these references, One Piece stops behaving as a simple adventure and starts behaving as a multinational, multi-era historical drama in disguise. You're not just island hopping, you're time hopping. You're watching the author remix slavery, colonialism, fascism, censorship, and civil rights into a single planned narrative spine. And if that sounds overdramatic, this is not a sin. This is normal pattern-seeking monkey behavior. But in this case, the patterns are intentional enough that we need to talk about where the map of One Piece Earth lines up almost one-to-one with our own, because that's where the next set of emotional gut punches are hiding. So when you start lining the map up and you realize, oh, that's just Spain with toys, or that's literally isolationist Edo Japan with dragons, you hit a different question. Why these histories and not others? Why Alabasta as Egypt, Dressrosa as Spain, Wano as Japan, Skypiea as Mesoamerica, Fishman Island as the Atlantic slave trade, but almost no explicit South Asian kingdom, no Central African empire, no deep dive into, say, the Congo or the Mughal court. Here's the thing. Part of this is just where Oda is standing as an author. He's a Japanese guy who grew up on Japanese textbooks, Japanese TV, Japanese film. For his core readership, European empires, World War analogues, the Atlantic slavery narrative, and Japan's own isolationist past are the default history pack. That's the stuff every kid in his community already has cached in their brain. So when he throws in Maria Zhu as Versailles/Vatican aristocracy, or Wano as Sengoku Japan, the foreshadowing lands instantly. You don't need a lore dump. The silhouette does the work. And then you add global media bias. Western film and anime imports have spent decades hammering the same canon. Rome, medieval Europe, Pirates of the Caribbean, the transatlantic trade, the Middle East as desert empire, Mesoamerica as tragic lost civilization. So Oda reaches for Alabasta as Egypt, Skypiea, and Shandora as Mayan/Aztec, Dressrosa as bullfights, and conquistador guilt, because those are already overrepresented in the global imagination. This is not a sin. This is normal. When you're building a world that has to read in one panel to a teenager, you grab the big, recognizable silhouettes first. But I need you to notice the negative space. There's no major arc that is clearly India. There's no long saga that is transparently the Belgian Congo. You get scattered aesthetics, a curry gag here, a jungle there, but not a full historical indictment the way Fishman Island is just the Middle Passage with mermaids. Why? Partly practicality. He probably doesn't know those histories in granular detail. Partly ethics and editorial reality. Some wounds are so raw, so politically charged, that doing a shonen battle riff on them risks trivializing real atrocities or tripping broadcast censors. Pattern interrupt. Imagine Marineford, but it's explicitly about partition violence or modern genocides instead of a more abstracted war. That's not running in Weekly Shonen Jump. That's a different category of manga, a different target demographic, and a different legal department having a panic attack. And yet, even within the approved syllabus of Europe, Japan, the Atlantic, and a bit of Mesoamerica and the Middle East, Oda keeps choosing the ugliest chapters. He doesn't just romanticize pirates as goofy adventurers. He drags you through Otohime's failed activism, O'Hara's erased scholars, the Shandians' dispossession, Dressrosa's living toys as enslaved underclass. The adventure is sugar on top of stories about oppression, resistance, and histories that the in-universe victors literally burn. So we need to hold two ideas at once. One Piece is not, and never had to be, a full survey course on global suffering. This is fine, but the choices of what's included and what's missing are still data. They tell you which real ghosts Oda feels confident summoning into his fantasy, and which ones he leaves off stage. And if you follow that trail, it points straight into the next problem. How far he's willing to go when he rewrites the biggest cover-up of all, the Void Century itself. And here's where we need to zoom out, because once you notice that Oda is picking and choosing real ghosts, you start to realize he isn't just doing a travel vlog with funny hats. He's drawing a century-long political cartoon of Earth and hiding it in Weekly Shonen Jump. Think about how political cartoons work. They take a country, a president, a war, and blow one feature up to grotesque proportions. Uncle Sam's nose gets longer, the bear gets bigger claws, the factory chimney spews skull-shaped smoke. It's distortion as argument. One Piece does the same thing with islands. Alabasta is not Egypt with sand. It's Egypt cranked to 11 to talk about drought, colonial interference, and a monarch trapped between his people and global powers. Dressrosa is not Spain with toys. It's a dictatorship compressed into a theme park nightmare, so Oda can yell about propaganda, coups, and disappeared citizens without ever saying the word Chile. Every arc is an editorial. Fishman Island is a front-page cartoon about racial discrimination, segregation, and the way trauma gets inherited. Eni's Lobby is a screaming op-ed on extradition, black sites, and governments that erase people with paperwork. Wano is isolationist Japan, but also every closed border, every nationalist myth, every industrialization push that chews up workers in factories and calls it progress. The real-world analogue is shorthand. You see Venetian canals in Water 7, and your brain imports centuries of maritime capitalism without Oda having to footnote Adam Smith. Now, here's the thing. The Straw Hats are not the cartoonists. They are the pen. They drift from caricatured nation to caricatured nation as total outsiders. And that's intentional. They're never fully of the culture they're fixing. They're the travelling lens that makes the contradictions pop. In Skypiea, they're the idiots crashing into a Mesoamerican coded holy war and accidentally exposing the colonial theft under it. In Dressrosa, they're the foreign criminals who see through the smiling toys before the locals can admit anything is wrong. They show up, break the metaphor, and sail away before the ink dries. And over 1,000 chapters that pattern adds up. Oda has basically drawn a satirical atlas of Earth's worst habits and best hopes. World government as a bloated Versailles-Vatican hybrid that hoards light at the top. Celestial dragons as every hereditary elite you've ever hated, distilled into one punchable helmet. The Revolutionary Army as the messy, romantic fantasy of global revolt that never quite fits in any real category of left, right, or centre. This is not a sin. This is not too political. This is storytelling admitting that politics were always already in the room. Listen to me. Saying One Piece is a political cartoon doesn't politicize it. It just admits the author made intentional choices about who gets crushed, who gets saved, and who gets to rewrite history. The pirate coats and devil fruits are camouflage. The foreshadowing is not just about future power-ups, it's about which systems are doomed to fall. And if that's true, then the biggest question isn't whether the world government loses. It's what, exactly, it's been hiding for 800 years. And how far Oda is willing to go when he finally takes the eraser to the Void Century's original map. So if Oda's been quietly redrawing the world for 25 years, the obvious question is, how do you actually watch future arcs with that in mind, without turning into the guy pausing every frame to give a TED talk on column orders? Because listen to me, I need you to not become that person. Your friends will mutiny. Here's the thing, you don't need a PhD to do this. You just need a stupidly simple 3-question checklist every time the crew hits a new island. First question, what does this place look at in terms of architecture and clothes? Are we in Alabaster-style desert kingdoms with Egyptian tombs, or Water 7 canals and Venetian masks, or Wano's Edo castles and top knots? Second question, how is power structured here? Are we under a Dressrosa tyrant, a reverie-tier monarchy, a theocracy, a corporate state, a pirate fiefdom? Third question, what myths or religions are in play? Sun gods, sky islands with angel iconography, fishman discrimination narratives, whatever. That's your starter kit. Once you've asked those, then you can do the fun part. 10 seconds of research, not a thesis, not homework. You see Maria Joie looking suspiciously Versailles meets Vatican. You Google Versailles court hierarchy, and suddenly the celestial dragon's whole deal snaps into focus. You see Shandora's stepped pyramids and sun motifs. You type Mesoamerican Temple City and go, oh, this is very Maya/Aztec coded. You notice a weird dish in Wano. You search it, and now you know Oda pulled it from a specific region of Japan. That's it. That's the move. And if your brain goes pattern-seeking monkey and starts seeing Jesus in every brick texture, this is normal. This is fine. The trick is to remember the difference between this feels reminiscent and the author intentionally planned a one-to-one allegory to the 30 Years' War. You're allowed to say, this reminds me of X without promoting it to canon foreshadowing of the Void Century's exact war map. Also, you do not need to run this checklist live on your first watch. Please don't. Let the arc hit you in the face first. Cry at Dressrosa, get mad at Sabaudi, be confused in Egghead. Then, on a rewatch, or when you're waiting 3 weeks for the next chapter because Oda's back exploded again, that's when you zoom in on the architecture and institutions. Story first, analysis second. Consuming art in real time without pausing every 10 seconds is not a sin. When you bring this stuff to the community, we need to talk about tone. Here's a cool extra layer I noticed. This island's layout is really close to Venice, lands very differently from how did you not realize Water 7 is obviously Italy. Are you illiterate? You're not scoring points, you're sharing toys. Frame it as, if you're curious, here's an example and a source, not, I alone have seen the truth of the ancient kingdom. Because the goal here is not to win a scavenger hunt for the most obscure reference. The goal is to deepen your respect for how intentional the writing is. When you see that Alabaster, Dressrosa, Wano, and whatever comes next are all riffing on real empires and real collapses, the foreshadowing stops being magic and starts being craft. And once you start watching arcs that way, you're ready for the next step. Asking what Oda is doing with all these borrowed histories when he finally pulls the trigger on the end of the world. And here's where we need to pump the brakes on the Oda is a prophet meme. Because once you see how much of One Piece is stitched out of real history and geography, the magic trick changes. It's not a crystal ball. It's a blender. Oda's real genius isn't that he sat down at age 20 and perfectly foresaw every twist, every joke, every silhouette reveal. His genius is that for 25 years he's been ruthlessly curious, constantly raiding history, myth and maps to keep feeding a story that was planned in broad strokes, but always hungry for more detail. Alabaster pulls in Egypt and desert kingdoms. Dressrosa raids Spain and gladiator Rome. Wano cannibalizes isolationist Japan. That's not prophecy. That's research plus obsession. And here's the thing. He almost never does a one-to-one allegory. Marie-Joie looks Versailles-coded. The celestial dragons feel European aristocracy-coded. But there is no "this guy is literally Louis XIV" NPC walking around. Fishman Island echoes the Atlantic slave trade. Sabaudi screams about human auctions, but it's filtered through fishermen, mermaids and Tenryubito in spacesuits. The reference is legible. The twist is original. It lives in that messy middle category where your brain goes, I recognise this, without turning the show into a History Channel reenactment with rubber swords. Now, pattern-seeking monkey moment. It's very easy for us to see a genocide plotline, or a Buster call, or O'Hara getting nuked, and go, yes, Oda is secretly writing a dissertation on 20th century war crimes. I need you to calm down. He's not a policy analyst. He's a shonen author who keeps pointing his fantasy camera at slavery, ethnic cleansing, state violence, and saying, kids are going to see this. I'm not going to lie to them. That's a different kind of intentional. He wraps it in rubber pirates and goofy animals so a 12-year-old can process it without being shattered, but he never treats it as a joke. The auction house is terrifying. The genocide of the Lunarians is horrifying. The Void Century is a slow-motion war crime. This is not a sin. This is not edgy for clout writing. This is storytelling that assumes the audience can handle real stakes, even if the names and islands are rearranged. And that respect is crucial. Oda assumes you will miss some references. This is fine. This is normal. But he also assumes you'll catch enough of the echo that when Robin cries over O'Hara, or when Kuma's past is hinted, you don't need a footnote saying this is about real-world atrocity. He trusts that fans can feel the weight. Zoom out, and he's not an outlier. He's in a very old tradition. Homer remixing Bronze Age collapse into sea monsters. Dante turning Italian politics into hell geography. Modern fantasy authors building empires out of Rome, Britain, or Meiji Japan. Oda is doing the same thing on weekly shonen Jump deadlines. Which raises a harder question. If he's been remixing our world this aggressively the whole time, what does that say about the kind of ending he's steering us toward? So here's where everything snaps into focus. We've been talking geography, history, myth in separate buckets. But listen to me. Oda is not running 3 different games. He's running one rigged casino, and every table is dealing the same cards with different art on them. Here's the thing. Once you see the 3 lenses, you can't unsee them. First category. Every island is a remixed country, a travel vlog run through a funhouse mirror. Alabaster isn't just Desert Ark. It's Egypt run through shonen pacing. The River Kingdom, the tombs, the ancient ruins, the giant stone poneglyph buried in a place that might as well have a sign saying, we invented history and then someone tried to erase us. Second category, history and politics. The world government, the revolutions, the Void Century. This is where the story stops pretending it's just pirates and starts cosplaying as a political science syllabus. Fishman Island is the cleanest example. On the surface, it's goofy underwater races and metaphors, with mermaids and bubble elevators. But you sit with it for 2 seconds, and it's civil rights, segregation, hate crimes, radicalization, state violence, and the question our own world still can't answer: how do you fix a system that was intentionally built broken? Third category, myth and religion. Devil fruits, ancient races, gods that may or may not be propaganda. Nika is the emblem here. To the people of Skypiea, he's a joke. To the world government, he's a redacted word. To the oppressed, he's this half-remembered liberation religion, the sun god who dances and laughs while chains fall off. That's not random. That's an author pulling from real-world slave religions, messiah myths, and resistance stories and then hiding them under rubber gags and drum solos. So when you see a new flag, a weirdly specific architectural style, a city that feels too coherent to be random, I need you to assume it's doing double duty. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, Oda weaponizing your pattern-seeking monkey brain that sees Jesus in toast and saying, yes, good. Do that, but with my backgrounds. Go back in your head for a second. Alabaster, Skypiea, Dressrosa, Wano. You can rewatch those arcs as pure adventure. This is fine. This is normal. But if you run them through this 3-lens filter, the story mutates. Alabaster turns into a case study in resource wars and imperial meddling. Skypiea stops being the weird sky detour and becomes a collision of colonialism and lost technology. Dressrosa goes from toy sadness to a thesis on dictatorships, propaganda, and disappeared people. Wano stops being just samurai country and turns into a meditation on isolationism, industrialization, and cultural erasure. And that's the payoff here. You didn't just sit through a lore dump. You quietly upgraded your operating system for reading One Piece. From now on, every time a new island shows up, every time a silhouette of some ancient god flashes on screen, you're not just asking, is this cool? You're asking, what real thing is this echoing? And why did he choose that? Because if he's been this intentional with the references on the way up, we need to talk about what happens when all those real-world echoes collide in the ending he's been foreshadowing for 25 years. And here's where I hand the conspiracy board over to you. If you've made it this far, you are no longer a casual viewer. You are now a fully deputized cartographer of Oda's cursed alternate Earth, and I need you to report in. Which country-to-island mapping or historical parallel actually made you stop and go, there's no way he did that on purpose? And then you realized it was absolutely intentional. Was it Alabaster lining up with Egypt, Dressrosa screaming Spain, or Marie-Auger doing Versailles cosplay on top of Vatican politics? Tell me in the comments. Tell me which ones you think I oversold and which ones I completely missed or underplayed. Because here's the thing. This world is too big for one over-caffeinated nerd with a map and a history degree. We need the rest of the community to drag in their own expertise. If you're from a Caribbean nation and you see your port city in Water Seven's canals, I want that. If you grew up in South Asia and Whole Cake or Fishman Island pinged something specific in your cultural memory, I want that even more. This is not a sin. This is not bad overthinking. This is in fact how most good fandom scholarship works. You bring your language, your architecture knowledge, your political science brain, your grandma's stories about colonialism or migration, and you test these mappings. You refine them. You correct me when I shove something into the wrong category, because I'm a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast every time Oda draws a dome or a column. And then, I need you to run the experiment yourself. Rewatch Alabaster, Skypiea, Dressrosa, Fishman Island, Wano with Friends, and go through them with the 3 lenses we've been using. Geography, history, mythology. Where is this? When is this? What story from our world is he smuggling in under the pirate flag? Pause the episode, argue about whether Skypiea is more Mesoamerican or something else. Ask which empire Fishman Island is echoing. Fight over whether Wano is just Edo Japan or a whole thesis on isolationism. Because the more we do that, the more prepared we are for the end game. And yes, this feeds directly into future videos. If you want a whole 2-hour breakdown on just the Void Century's historical models, we can do that. If you want an irresponsible deep dive into Devil Fruit mythologies, race design, and why the Lunarians are basically Oda speedrunning religious symbolism, we can do that too. But that only works if this little cartography project keeps growing. So, if you survive 2.5 hours of me screaming about maps and foreshadowing, congratulations. You are now officially part of the Overthinking One Piece Correctly Club. Hit like, subscribe, and share this with the one friend who won't block you for pausing the episode to talk about ancient empires. I'll bring the next wall of yarn when you're ready.